Good morning. Welcome to the Thursday, February 23rd meeting of the Delta Stewardship Council. I'd like to call this meeting to order and begin with roll call.
Johnston here. Damro here. Weinberg here.
Tatayan here.
Fiorini here. We have a quorum. Two of our members are in the building and will be joining us shortly. The next item on the agenda is to recess to closed executive session. For those of you that are following on the webcast, I'm anticipating that we will be reconvening an open session in about an hour. So check in before 10 o'clock and hopefully we'll be back by then. So we are now recessed to closed executive session. Good morning. I'd like to reconvene an open session and report to you that no action was taken in closed session. Let's redo the roll call because we have two additional council members here since we convened at 9 a.m.
Damro here.
Weinberg here. Gatto here.
Tatayan here.
Fiorini here.
Thompson here.
We have a quorum, and we have a brand new council member. Assembly member Mike Gatto, retired, has recently joined us. And Mike, this would be a good opportunity just to say hi to the folks here in the audience and those that are following us on the webcast, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, hi, everybody. My name is Mike Gatto. It's a silly term to...
There's a button on at the.
All right. You'd think I would know how to operate a microphone after gabbing in the legislature for 7 years. But good morning, everybody. My name is Mike Gatto. I did just retire from the California State Assembly, or rather, term limits retired me. My district is a Southern California-based district, but came to know and love the Delta region, of course, during my time in Sacramento. Really do think it's a tremendous asset for the state of California and one that should be cherished all up and down the state. It's a tremendous honor to be here. There's a lot to learn. I've been reading a whole lot of information and hearing from people, members of the public who have opinions on this, and I will do my best not to screw up, and I hope if I do, you let me know, and I look forward to meeting each and every one of you and hearing from you in case there's anything that you would like to consider. So thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Welcome aboard. Next item, file item number 5, adoption of our January 26th, 2017 meeting summary.
Second.
Johnston moves, several seconds. Any discussion? All right, let's take the vote.
Damro aye.
Weinberg aye. Gatto aye.
Tatayan aye.
Fiorini, aye.
Thompson aye.
Motion passes unanimously. File item number 6, Chair's Report. I learned a new term this month, and I think Cliff is going to expand upon it. It's called weather whiplash. You can't really begin today's meeting without acknowledging the shift in weather patterns that we've experienced. 2015, probably the driest year on record in California, and now we may be on the verge of the wettest year on record within a 2-year time frame. I think the relevance of the work that we have been doing becomes more important, and the public becomes more aware and more interested in what we were doing. Oftentimes we talk about the transportation system and how the need for improvements to our transportation system in California is something that many people are aware of because they're experiencing it every day. But when it comes to water, if you turn the tap on and water comes out, you don't necessarily understand that there are potential problems and needs for investment behind that tap. So kudos to all that are working very hard to deal with the high flows of water. I think as far as the Delta region is concerned, so far so good, but it's, as we know, the levees in the Delta are the hardest working levees in the world on call 24/7, 365. So we continue to wish everyone well that has frontline responsibilities in the Delta. This past month, we have been working with the Central Valley Flood Protection Board and the Department of Water Resources to further our work on the work group that was set up to try and weave together the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan and our Delta Levee investment strategy. I had the opportunity to attend one of the Central Valley Flood Protection Board's field meetings in Merced last Thursday. It was interesting that they're initiating their environmental review. There were essentially no members of the public there. There were a couple of Merced County representatives, DWR, and flood board staff. But I had the opportunity to evaluate their plan in light of what our plan looks like, and I think there's our effort to synthesize the work that we're all doing is coming along very well. One of the things I noted in particular was they have, in their first 10 years, a plan to purchase additional property in the Paradise Cut area to improve the floodplain inundation and relieve stress on the flood system in the lower San Joaquin. That's in keeping with what we've called for in the Delta Plan. It's in keeping with a high priority in our levee investment strategy. So one example of an area that the plans are well linked. There was going to be a Senate Natural Resources and Water Committee hearing that I was scheduled to speak at in regards to our role with water fix because of the emergency response in Oroville. That hearing was postponed, but I anticipate that we'll be getting a call to have that hearing sometime soon. And then finally, our search for the next lead scientist began this month with interviewing the first of 4 candidates. The next 3 candidates will be going through their interview process next month, and hopefully we'll be in a position within 2 or 3 months to have identified who Cliff Daum's successor will be. There's no one more interested in the success of this process than Cliff. When he came, I made a personal promise that we would do everything we could to find a suitable replacement by the time he was scheduled to retire in September. It looks like I'm going to be able to make good on that promise. So, Cliff, we're working on it. That concludes my report, unless anyone has any questions. All right, then on to file item number 7, the Executive Officer's Report. Jessica Pearson.
Okay, thank you and good morning. Illustrative of California's weather extremes, as Randy was saying, only 4 months ago we were speculating about the potential for a 6th straight year of below normal precipitation, and now we're faced with overtopping slumps, breaks, flood fighting, and even evacuations. Major Northern California reservoirs have gone from 40 to 60% full at the start of the water year in October to nearly full or even spilling in the case of Oroville and Don Pedro. Further indicative of California's water dichotomy, even as surface water storage nears capacity in the North State, many of the state's groundwater basins remain seriously depleted. Estimates are that it would take decades before some of the aquifers in the Tulare Basin and southern San Joaquin Valley will return to near full capacity. So thankfully, to my knowledge, flood events thus far in the Delta have not led to injuries or worse, and heroic flood fighting efforts on Tyler Island, for example, have so far been successful in staving off a breach. McCormick-Williamson Tract at the confluence of the Cosumnes and the McCullamy Rivers, long slated for tidal marsh restoration, did flood, and next steps for restoration efforts are unclear. For anyone who may have thought that our levee investment strategy was a theoretical exercise, recent events have certainly proven otherwise. The events of the last 2 weeks really illustrate some key points that were foundational for the development of the Delta Plan and point to the timeliness of our current amendments. California's precipitation is highly variable, and it will become more so with climate change. A year like this clearly indicates that additional storage is essential if done correctly. Additional storage alone is not nearly enough, especially now reservoir releases are constrained by downstream channel capacity, making the already difficult balancing act between water storage and flood control even more challenging. We have to be able to move water at greater capacity during these brief windows and do so in more environmentally sensitive ways. If you can't get water across the delta when it is available, storage only does you so much good. So a year like this, feast after famine, makes our discussion of agenda items 12 and 16, our Delta Plan amendments, all the more timely. It's important to note that conservation remains a critical component of overall water supply reliability. Even as the state seems literally overflowing with water, efficient use needs to become an ingrained habit and not just something that we do during a drought. And that's at least part of the reason why the State Water Resources Control Board extended emergency regulations a few weeks ago, despite many urging their relaxation. And they'll revisit the issue again in May, and we'll report back on any activity. A key secondary benefit of the emergency regulations have been regular reporting of urban water use throughout the state, and this was called for in our Delta Plan to better understand who's using how much water and where so that statewide planning can better match availability and need. As we enter into a new phase of our conveyance storage and operations Delta Plan amendment, we'll have a round of public workshops, and staff will provide details on that later in the agenda. Randy also mentioned our quest for a new lead scientist and the associated brown bags, and flyers with those dates, times, and names are on our table and also on our website. This month we sent one Delta Plan coordination letter, which is included in your binder. It's in relation to the Honker Bay Conservation Bank, which is a proposed tidal aquatic habitat mitigation bank on Wheeler Island, north of Honker Bay in the Sassoon Marsh. The bank is intended to provide mitigation credits for salmonids, longfin smelt, and delta smelt, and our letter generally provides advice and recommendations for Delta Plan consistency. We had some great hires over the last month. Q Nguyen is our new receptionist at the front desk. She's joining us after 8 years as an administrative coordinator for the Folsom Cordova Unified School District. And Ron Melser is our new senior environmental scientist in the Performance Management Office of the Planning Division. Ron joins us from the Department of Water Resources, where he's worked for the last 7 years in the Floodway Ecosystem Sustainability Branch. He has experience developing measurable objectives and metrics and restoration strategies for the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, and expertise in river modeling and Central Valley riparian bird conservation. He holds a master's degree in biology from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and is currently completing his PhD in geography at UC Davis. Finally, Delia Ruiz joins us from the Employment Development Department as our new Senior Personnel Specialist in our Administration Division. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bethany Payne for our legal update.
Thank you, Jessica and Chair Fiorini and members. As Adam makes his way up here to give you a topical update on 3 cases this month, I'd like to take the chance to address a comment letter that Chair Fiorini received yesterday afternoon, or a portion of the comment letter from local agencies of the North Delta requesting that you all consider amending the 2016 annual report that was just presented to you last month to address the status of the Delta Plan litigation that's ongoing. I wanted to take this opportunity to remind the public that rather than put that information in a static document that's only produced once a year, we have a web page dedicated to the litigation, and staff and I are currently in the process, coincidentally, of updating it now that we're in a place in the litigation where all the appeals have been filed, all the cross appeals have been filed, and it's a good time to now get that page updated. we're expecting that they'll take another 2 or 3 days, depending on how long these council meetings take. The next couple of days, maybe earlier. But that web page is always up, and it will become current in the next 2 or 3 days. Thank you. Now, Adam has a legal update for you on 3 cases that I think you'll find topical, including an update on Cliff's Pulseful case.
Thank you, Chair Fiorini, members of the council. The first case we'll be discussing today, in light of current events, involves Lake Oroville. The case is the County of Butte versus the California Department of Water Resources. So as part of its duties under the United States Department of Energy, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, is responsible for licensing and inspecting private, municipal, and state hydroelectric projects. And in 1957, the Federal Power Commission, or the predecessor to FERC, granted a 50-year license to the California Water Project Authority, or the predecessor of DWR, to build and operate the hydropower facilities at Lake Oroville. Now, the DWR's federal license to own and operate those facilities was set to expire on January 31st of 2007. So as a result, on January 26th of 2005, DWR applied with FERC to renew the licenses for an additional 50 years. And as part of that relicensing requirements, DWR released a final environmental impact report on July 22nd of 2008. On August 21st of 2008, Butte and Plumas counties separately filed petitions for writ of mandates in the Butte County Superior Court alleging deficiencies in the final EIR. The petitions were consolidated and transferred to the Yolo County Superior Court, where Judge McGuire denied all claims on June 20th of 2012. So Butte and Plumas counties timely appealed to California's 3rd Appellate District. Now, Butte and Plumas counties primarily argue that the final EIR failed to adequately consider the impacts of climate change on the Oroville facilities. The counties allege that DWR ignored warnings that refusing to adjust for climate change in tests of infrastructure performance would leave unstudied dangers of system failures and loss of reservoir control. The counties also allege that the EIR improperly expects current hydrologic conditions to continue for the foreseeable future, despite scientists stating over the project term that climate change will likely impact flood control, reservoir storage, flow levels, water temperatures, power generation, water qualities, fisheries, and recreation. Now, this case remains in the 3rd Appellate District as organizations such as Friends of the River and the California Sport Fishing Protection Alliance have filed amicus briefs in support of the counties. Now, the next 2 cases we'll be discussing involve pulse flows. The first is the San Luis and Delta Mendota Water Authority et al. Versus the United States Department of the Interior et al. On February 21st, 2017, Judges Alex Kaczynski and N. Randy Smith of the 9th Circuit and Judge Sharon L. Gleason, sitting by designation from the United States District Court from the District of Alaska, held that the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation had authority to release additional Trinity River water from the Lewiston Dam to protect fish in the lower Klamath River. On August 12, 1955, Congress passed an act creating the Trinity River Division. Under the so-called 1955 Act, the Bureau constructed the Trinity and Lewiston dams on the Trinity River. So water flows out of the Trinity Alps into Trinity Reservoir, and then subsequently into the Lewiston Reservoir, which is located 8 miles downstream. At the Lewiston Dam, the water either continues down the Trinity River and eventually into the Klamath River, or it is diverted by the Bureau to the Sacramento River via the Clear Creek Tunnel to be used in the Central Valley Project. In 2002, low flows, high water temperatures, and a high density of fish allowed 2 pathogens to flourish in the Klamath River, which resulted in the deaths of roughly 34,000 fish. So in 2013, the Bureau, in an effort to avoid a similar occurrence, proposed releasing an additional 62,000 acre-feet of water from Lewiston Dam into the Trinity River. The Bureau concluded in its final environmental assessment that the 1955 Act and California law authorized such a release. The plaintiffs, who include local water districts that hold CVP contracts filed suit shortly thereafter, seeking to prevent the releases. And after the district court ruled for the plaintiffs, the Bureau appealed to the Ninth Circuit to consider whether the Bureau was authorized under the 1955 Act and California law to release additional water from the Lewiston Dam to protect fish populations in the lower Klamath River. The 1955 Act provides that the Secretary is authorized and directed to adopt appropriate measures to ensure the preservation and propagation of fish and wildlife. The court noted that because the Act contains no limiting language, geographic or otherwise, Congress intended to delegate a broad authority to the Bureau to determine what constitutes appropriate measures, which may include potential water releases above the minimum requirements. The court also noted that certain sections of the Central Valley Project Improvement Act were too specific to alter or limit the scope of the authority granted to the Bureau by the 1955 Act. Additionally, the court noted that under California law, dam owners, including the federal government, are required to release enough water to keep in good condition any fish that may be planted or exist below the dam. So therefore, the court concluded that the Bureau was authorized under the 1955 Act and California law to release additional Trinity River water from the Lewiston Dam to protect the fish in the lower Klamath River. Now, the last case we'll be discussing, you may remember from our December legal update, that is the Yurok Tribe et al. Versus the United States Bureau of Reclamation et al. On November 26, 2016, the Yurok Tribe filed a lawsuit against the United States Bureau of Reclamation in the United States District Court for the Northern District of California. The suit alleged that the Bureau's mismanagement of the Klamath Project allowed the parasite Ceratonova shasta, or C. shasta, to flourish to the detriment of the Southern Oregon, Northern California coast coho salmon. On February 8th of 2017, Judge William H. Orrick noted that it is undisputed that the Bureau was obligated to reinitiate formal consultation under the Endangered Species Act after the C. shasta infection rates exceeded the maximum percentage permitted by the 2013 incidental take statement. The judge further issued a preliminary injunction featuring protective flows and ordering the Bureau, until formal consultation under the ESA is complete, to require both winter-spring flushing flows designed to dislodge and flush out the parasites, as well as emergency dilution flows to protect the juvenile coho salmon. So we will continue to monitor these cases and other pertinent cases, and we look forward to our next legal update in March. Does anybody have any questions?
I
Questions,
have a
madam?
question about the first case you were discussing. Is that case pending in the Third District Court of Appeals?
The Third Appellate District.
Is that scheduled for argument anytime soon?
Not that was indicated on the docket. The last action of the case was the amicus briefs being filed by those two organizations.
Susan?
Thank you, Adam. That was an excellent briefing. On the first case, what are the plaintiffs hoping to gain? What do they want out of this?
It's a CEQA challenge, challenging the adequacy of the EIR that was prepared for the FERC relicensing effort. So they're hoping to get the EIR declared invalid and started over again.
Any, Ken?
Just on the last case, the issue was that the Bureau had an incidental take permit for an incidental take of the infected species, and then they had to, that wasn't contemplated in the permit, and they had to remedy, by releasing. Is it?
Yeah. Oh, so yeah, in the Yurok case, so the incidental take statement for 2013 allowed a certain percentage of the juvenile cohos to be infected by this particular parasite, and in those particular years, the infection rates exceeded that during
So that's
low flows. So they were obligated then to go back and reinitiate consultation under the ESA, and then also release flows to remedy.
So they shouldn't have been surprised by that.
No, and in fact, they're initiating the consultation right now.
Anything else? Adam, great briefing. Thank you. Oh, yes. Good.
Well, I had something for Jessica.
Okay.
Her report. Just really quickly, you talked about Tyler Island. Oh, I'm sorry, I thought I had it on. You talked about Tyler Island, and there was rapid repair activities going on there, emergency repair activities. So that would be interesting. I know tomorrow we're talking about the levy investment strategy, but it's sort of, we've almost got lessons learned opportunities here just from what we're seeing and some of our recommendations about stockpiling materials and that kind of thing. Be interesting to know, how successful those repair activities, if some of our recommendations were implemented, would that have meant,
Absolutely.
better outcome, that kind of thing.
Yeah, we've certainly been watching all the events closely for a number of reasons, one of which is to kind of think through, if our recommendations were in place, how would this play out? And Dan and Dustin will be happy to speak to that tomorrow on the agenda item.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know, especially on the island where you had a failure, whether, when's the last inspection that occurred?
Well, and to be fair, it wasn't a breach of the levee. It slumped on the inland side, and rapid response to get it shored up, and it prevented a breach.
Correct.
So that's one issue. On the McCormick-Williamson issue, now that it's flooded and it was projected to become a tidal habitat, the question is, and it goes to our levee investment strategy priorities, will that levee be repaired and the island reclaimed, or will it be left in this current state and adjusted and we don't have the answer to that, but we'll be calling on people to come before us probably in a month or two that have the answer. Okay.
Okay, and with that, we can move on to our legislative update with Ryan Stamborough.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members, and welcome to Assemblymember Gatto. With last Friday's bill introduction deadline, nearly 2,500 bills have come into print since the beginning of the new session in December. While many are still in spot bill form or placeholder form, meaning that the member intends to further develop the bill in the weeks to come, there are a few substantive measures relating to council interests that I'll be highlighting this morning. However, before getting into specifics, I thought it might be beneficial to provide a little context on how the legislative matrix in your binder is developed as we embark on the new two-year session. The scope of the bills found in the document is based predominantly on a handful of criteria. First,
and this is agenda item 7, just to...
Thank you for that. These include measures that specifically impact the Delta, the Reform Act, the Delta Plan, and or those where the council is specifically mentioned. The next lens includes bills that impact the Delta in the broader context of the state. This is a little bit more ambiguous. However, maybe for an example, the overwhelming majority of critically overdrafted groundwater basins obviously exists south of the Delta in the Central Valley. However, as SGMA begins to take hold and overdraft is addressed, there's obviously going to be a real question as to how that will impact demands on the Delta. And then finally, the third lens includes bills that broadly impact the state policy pertaining to things like water supply, water quality, water conservation, habitat restoration, climate adaptation, and public infrastructure. So the third one's a little bit more of a catch-all. Obviously, at each monthly update, I don't plan to go through each bill. I typically select a handful of measures, but am happy to discuss any bills that you see might pique your interest.
Ryan, one of your predecessors included a bill that referenced water and beer making, so I just wanted to point that out.
So noted, Mr. Chairman. So obviously, early on, I tend to cast a rather wide net in terms of the bills that are included in the matrix, and obviously, as the process plays out, this tends to get pared down rather significantly. So it is intended to be a living document, and I will make changes as at each council meeting. And I will note ones where there will be significant additions or amendments as well. So, moving on to specific bills. Assembly Bill 472 by Assembly Member Jim Frazier, who represents portions of the Western and Central Delta. Current law encourages landowners who are fallowing their land in order to provide water for transfer to also retain natural vegetation for wildlife habitat purposes. AB 472 builds upon this permissive provision by requiring DWR to establish an incentive program that would not only further encourage this activity, but would also potentially lead some landowners to undertake such an action on a more permanent basis. As the council will recall, the Delta Plan encourages farmers in the Delta to implement management practices that maximize habitat values, given that some native species have adapted to using agricultural lands as habitat in place of tidal marshes, grasslands, and seasonal wetlands. So while the bill, I would say, is still very much conceptual in terms of its development, I also do think it's fair to say it does hold some potential, and I will be providing further update on that as things progress. In addition to AB 472, Assemblymember Frazier also introduced 4 Delta-related spot bills that will take shape in the coming weeks. These pertain to conveyance, flood protection, and broader financing for the Delta. As I said, these are all intent bills, and they currently do not have any real substantive provisions in them at this point. The next bill that came into print just this week, so it is not unfortunately included in your matrix, is AB 1369 by Assembly Member Adam Gray from Merced, which proposes to earmark 25% of the cap and trade funds for the purpose of increasing the state's water storage capacity by 25% by 2025 and 50% by 2050. This is taking a similar approach to what we've seen with things in the state with regards to renewable portfolio standard on RPS and the like. The bill goes on to specify that the increase in storage sought by the bill may be met through a variety of both storage of both surface and groundwater storage projects. So based on 2015-16 auction revenue proceeds, this bill would result in approximately $450 million annually to fund these sorts of projects. And with recent storage capacity estimates for the state at approximately 200 million acre feet, DWR, the lead agency identified in the bill, would be required to increase storage capacity by around 50 million acre feet over the course of the next 8 years to meet the 2025 target. So for context, the 2 biggest reservoirs in the state, Shasta and Lake Oroville, account for around 8 million acre feet in combined capacity, while proposed projects such as Sites and Temperance Flat would add an additional 2 million acre feet in additional capacity. So in sum, this bill would obviously require a substantial increase in storage investment to meet the prescribed targets. And obviously, given that nearly 3/4 of the state's current capacity is in groundwater, I would presume that would be a primary target as to how you would meet the bill's prescribed targets. And then the final bill I'll discuss this morning is Senate Bill 252 by Senator Bill Dodd, who, as you'll recall, now holds the District 3 seat that encompasses the majority of the Delta, formerly occupied by Senator Lois Wolk. Citing a need for greater transparency in critically overdrafted groundwater basins, SB 252 would require an individual seeking a new well permit to notify adjacent landowners of the proposed project and agree to cease production if the relevant groundwater sustainability agency, under SGMA, finds that the well contributes to an undesirable result, such as degraded water quality or significant land subsidence, for instance. Moreover, this bill would require the city or county where the well is proposed to publicly notice the project and would make a municipality's compliance a condition for receiving future state funding for water supply projects. As an aside, this bill does share some similarities with Senator Dodd's predecessor, Senator Wolk, who authored a bill last year that would have prohibited the new construction of a well in basins of critical overdraft. That bill ultimately failed in the Senate Policy Committee phase. And then, as previously mentioned, it is rather early in the legislative calendar, so I would anticipate further development of the aforementioned bills in the coming months as policy committees begin to further deliberate these measures. And then, as the chair previously mentioned in his remarks, we were scheduled to speak at a February 14th Senate Natural Resources and Water hearing on water fix. And then the hearing, and then the committee also anticipated a February 28th hearing. It was a two-part hearing, and the second part was was labeled Perspectives on Water Fix, both of which were subsequently canceled given the events in Oroville, and we anticipate those will be rescheduled, but a date has yet to be established. And with that, Mr. Chairman, that concludes my report. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ryan. Questions of Ryan? Susan? And then Ken?
Ryan, I have a question on AB 487. What sort of changes to Sigma would this bill make?
So at this point, council member, it is purely an intent bill. So that is the extent to which the bill actually would address it. So it's kind of laying the groundwork that this is where they intend to further develop policy, but at this point, it's purely an intent bill. Yeah, but I'm happy to keep an eye on that and update you.
Ken?
Yeah, before I make my comment, and this is more of a comment, I'm going to defer to my colleagues who are actual legislators, but Ryan and I talked a little bit about 472, and it seems like, what I've noticed in my short time, which is now becoming one of the longer terms on the council, is there's usually not a lot of legislation that really impacts the delta or the co-equal goals, and it seems like Assemblyman Frazier's bill sort of gets at a key issue on environmental restoration and a tool that could be helpful. And I think it sort of gets into this idea of trying to incentivize things that would advance the co-equal goal. So I'm wondering, are there things that we should really try and focus on in terms of legislation that can further the co-equal goals, and maybe something like this I think could have broad support. Those spot bills, maybe a question is those spot bills that have been put in place, you said they're maybe about funding or things, but those are other vehicles. Should we be kind of looking at trying to further some of what we're trying to do by working with those offices. And, and again, Senator De Leon's, the $3 billion bond measure, I'll defer to everybody else on the likelihood of that moving forward. But again, that's something, we've spent a lot of time, we're going to talk tomorrow about the levy investment strategy, and there is no excess of funding for any of the activities we're trying to promote. So it just seems like, maybe we should sort of focus on some of this legislation that really has the opportunity to move some of our goals forward. Now, again, I may be wrong on that, but I just wanted to kind of put that out there for everybody.
Yeah, we do have an adopted policy on when and how and where the council takes positions on legislative measures. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but so far in the 6-7 years of the council, we've taken a position maybe on only 2 bills, and typically not early in the session, as they change quite a bit. So our process is that the ledge director, working with myself, would make a recommendation if we feel there's a role for the council, but alternatively, it's completely up to the council about how active they want to be on that front. So I think for now, as we're early in the stages, we'll probably want to wait and maybe meet with the author's staff and just get more information about that particular bill, and we can continue to report back to you.
Yeah, and Ryan's got a good sense of what is relevant. In terms of the land fallowing water transfers, there could potentially be an important interest on the part of the council, because currently land fallowing water transfers require pretty much a scorched earth approach. If there's anything living there in terms of weeds or crop, then it's ineligible for water transfer. So to encourage habitat for waterfowl, it's going to require some adjustment, which I think we would probably want to help.
Yeah, I mean, I think and I recognize it's early in the process, but early in the process helps you shape where the legislation goes. And it just seems like maybe there's some things there that, further what we're trying to accomplish, and clearly incentivizing landowners to create habitat in the Delta is something that is in the interest of the co-equal goals.
Skip?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On the water fix hearings at the Senate, could the council be kept in the loop as far as when they're going to be held?
Certainly.
Thank you.
Anything else of Ryan? And thank you very much, Ryan.
Thank you.
Okay. So just to preview the agenda over the next 2 days, after Cliff's lead scientist report, we'll be hearing from the chair of the Delta Independent Science Board on their recent accomplishments and their 2017 work plan. And then I, along with senior staff, will be presenting details of our 2017 priority work plan. Then we'll be hearing a status update on water fix, and then perhaps after lunch jump into consideration of the first staff discussion draft on a conveyance storage operation Delta Plan amendment. Tomorrow we will reconvene and consider a fresh revised draft of our Delta Levy Investment Strategy Delta Plan amendment, and we hope to conclude perhaps by lunch on Friday. And with that, that concludes my executive officer's report.
Any questions of Jessica? All right, great. Thanks, Jessica. On to file item number 8, lead scientist report, Dr. Cliff Dahm. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Randy. So I have 6 items I'm going to share with you today. Before I launch into that, Jessica has already provided you some information about the very interesting changing dynamics of our weather and climate. And Randy introduced the concept of weather whiplash. I'll build on that a little bit during my presentation. Another way of looking at conditions within the United States is to follow the U.S. Drought Monitor, which comes out weekly. The U.S. Drought Monitor has just issued its most recent release today. It's current up through February the 21st, and I thought that it might be interesting just to compare that. So 2 years ago, all of California was in various levels of drought. It was either in moderate, severe, or exceptional drought. As we now look at the state of California, and with this latest monitor report, we now have 83% of the state out of drought. We have about 17% in drought, and most of that is in the moderate drought category. So dramatic change in 2 years over the drought monitor conditions that exist within California. Last month I was not here, and I want to publicly thank Reiner Henneke, who subbed for me, and I actually was listening in from afar. If you have somebody on your docket that was calling in from San Juan, Puerto Rico. That was me. And do want to thank Reiner for giving you a nice presentation and summarizing some of the things that are going on in the science world. I did want to start my report with a little bit of a report on the meeting that I was attending. I think it's interesting and a germane meeting to present to you. It's a Chapman Conference. Chapman Conferences are run by the American Geophysical Union. They're on selected topics that have been identified to be of interest. I was actually invited to participate in this almost 2 years ago, and so it took them that long to kind of get the resources together and get all the planning done. The meeting basically was, the focus of the meeting was extreme climatic events and their focus on aquatic ecosystems. And interesting that we would have such a meeting going on when extreme climatic events were occurring in California when I was pretty far away. The meeting itself highlighted about 20 invited talks. Mine was one of those. Mine was actually focused on work that I did before I came to the council, so I talked about the effects of extreme forest fire and how those forest fires generate conditions that when flows are reinitiated, you get very serious water quality degradation. So that was my plenary talk. There were a lot of interesting plenary talks. I'm not going to highlight all 20 or so of them, but I'm going to highlight a few. The one thing I thought I'd do to kind of introduce this topic is to bring in a little bit of additional information that I think might be of interest to you. There is actually a part of the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration that actually monitors extreme climatic events and basically collects data on all events where more than $1 billion worth of damage was done from these extreme climatic events. They have normalized the data to 2016 dollars, so basically we are looking at dollar, kind of current dollar type of analysis. There have been 203 such of these weather climate events, these extreme climatic events within the United States since 1980. They have cost us over $1.1 trillion in terms of the amount of resources that were needed to deal with these extreme climatic events. The two largest, as you might guess, Katrina and Sandy. The numbers of these have been increasing through time. The average for the total period of record is about 5 or 6 of these a year. That's kind of your typical number. But in the last, since 2012 through 2016, we've had almost 11 on average. So these kind of extreme events appear to be increasing. We could debate how much of that is due to climate change and how much of that is due to more people being in harm's way, but certainly when you add this up, these kinds of events are becoming more frequent. And I am sure that the recent events here in California will make the series of atmospheric rivers that we've seen here, that California will be on the list for 2017 with $1 billion plus climatic event having already occurred here in the first couple months of 2017. Some of the talks that were given I thought were quite interesting. I'm going to highlight ones that might be interest here. Laurel Larson from the University of California at Berkeley, I thought, gave a very nice talk about extreme drought and how it affects coastal coho salmon, and looked at basically the importance of identifying where we have persistent perennial springs that can serve as refugia for these kinds of fish during these extreme droughts. In places where those kind of refugia existed, fish were able to survive and overcome this multi-year drought, but where groundwater, for example, depletions have reduced spring flow or have eliminated spring flow, the salmon didn't do so well. So she had a nice series of studies here in coastal California, northern coastal California, documenting those kinds of things. The talk that had to do with weather whiplash was given by Amy Bergen of the University of Kansas. This is always fun when you see a young scientist produce a invited paper that you get really excited by. I've known Amy since she was a graduate student at Michigan State University, and she's now a faculty member. She's doing really good things. The idea of weather whiplash is something that I'm not sure whether she coined the term or whether she found it and liked it, but she basically put it in her title. What she was looking at relative to weather whiplash was row crop agriculture in the central part of the United States also faces significant drought on occasion. What often happens then during these significant droughts is it kind of primes the pump for when intense thunderstorms arrive. It then allows the mobilization of large quantities of both sediment and nutrients, and her study was a very detailed study of how the state of Iowa basically went from a drought to very, very strong thunderstorms, and she documented very nicely what happened in terms of the movement of sediment and nutrients into their waterways and ultimately down through the Mississippi River system and into the Gulf of Mexico. Nice study, and I think the term weather whiplash is likely to catch on. I hear some people already using it, including our chair. Peter Raymond from Yale University gave a very nice talk about a hypothesis that he has published on recently. It's the idea of pulsing and shunning of materials through waterways associated with high flow events. Basically what he is building on a global database that he's assembled is how systems during moderate to low flow tend to be pretty efficient at processing materials that are in transport and in solution and removing those materials, but it is these pulses, it is these more extreme events when lots of material gets mobilized and very little processing occurs in transit. Much of this material then makes its way into bigger waterways and ultimately into our coastal oceans. And so he provided some examples of this from his work around the world. Emily Bernhardt from Duke University had an interesting talk on the widespread conversion of peatlands and wetlands in coastal North Carolina to farmland. I found it interesting. Basically, this is what happened in the Delta 150 years ago. We're talking about this process going on in North Carolina about 50 years ago. So she provided a number of studies about how these now converted wetlands that are in coastal North Carolina are being faced increasingly with coastal surges and with rising sea level, and so they're now beginning to have salinization problems for a lot of these areas that had been converted into agriculture. So she's trying to provide some ways to allow some of these systems that are no longer probably going to be viable as farmland to return, and she's looking at restoration efforts then to get some of these back into wetland conditions. So those are some examples of the types of talks that were at this conference, and extreme climatic events and their effects on aquatic systems seems pretty interesting for here in the council. There is, if any of you want additional information, I'll be happy to provide the link to the abstracts and the website that's been developed for this Chapman conference. The second item I wanted to bring to your attention, or actually introduce our speaker, is last month we had the Delta Science Fellow, who was the winner of the best oral presentation at the Bay Delta Science Conference held in November of 2017 here in Sacramento. So Rachel Wigginton gave a talk to you. I think those of you who are here probably remember her presentation. She is a Delta Science Fellow, supported by the Sea Grant Science Fellow program that we run, and it's due to your support that we are able to fund these kinds of excellent students who are either finishing up a PhD or they are in the early stages after their PhD of doing a postdoctoral fellowship. So we decided that today that we would invite to the council meeting the winner of the best poster presentation, who also turns out to be one of our Delta Science Fellows. And this is Allison Whipple. Allison, I'll let you work your way up to give a presentation on your research, but while Allison is doing that, I wanted to highlight another accomplishment of Allison that I think is quite substantive and was done when she was a staff member at the Aquatic Science Center of the San Francisco Estuary Institute. She and her colleagues have produced a document that was published in August of 2012 titled Sacramento San Joaquin Delta Historical Ecology Investigations, Exploring Pattern and Process. This has really become a document that, even with its huge size, gets read by a lot of people. And this is a very scholarly examination of historical information to assess the ecological status and trends within the Delta. And Allison was the lead on this. She's since decided to go back to school at UC Davis to do her PhD, and clearly still doing great work, as her poster will show, and I'm going to let her give an overview of what she presented at the conference. Randy, did you have a question you wanted to ask? Or?
I was just going to say, we've already given Mike a lot to read.
You want to give this one?
Now he's really intimidated.
I'll be happy to share my copy with you.
Thank you.
Allison, would you like to highlight some of the content of your
Great.
oral presentation?
Yeah, thank you. And
Welcome.
as the slides get up here, great, thank you. Okay, so you should be able to see that. So thank you, Cliff, and thank you all for inviting me here today to introduce you to my research on how flow patterns in floodplains change over space and time. And I'm looking at this in order to be able to look at the effects of restoration. And so floodplain ecosystems are some of the most diverse and productive globally, but they're also some of the most threatened. They provide many ecosystem functions as well as ecosystem services that humans rely on, and many of these help meet the multiple objectives of the Delta Plan. And by nature of their landscape position, floodplains accumulate many interacting impacts, stressors, that together alter what happens out within floodplains, alter those flooding patterns and processes that ecosystems rely on. And so floodplain ecosystem restoration is really a global challenge, and one that is acutely felt in the Delta. And the Delta Plan recognizes this. It sees a future where streams connect dynamically to seasonal functional floodplains, but really the question is, within the highly managed landscapes of our Delta, what does appropriate seasonal flooding dynamics actually look like? And so my research helps inform that question. It provides decision support tools for planning habitat restoration that's recommended within the Delta Plan, consistent with ERR2, as well as addresses high-impact science actions that are recommended by the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee. And so my research is focused on the Cosumnes River floodplain, which provides a unique opportunity for this sort of research for two primary reasons. One is that the Cosumnes River actually doesn't have a major dam on it, so it has a largely natural flow regime. And then secondly, the Nature Conservancy over the last several decades has performed a number of levee breach and levee setback restoration projects, such that the river accesses its floodplain fairly regularly. And so I'm modeling the most recent restoration project, which was implemented in the fall of 2014, which is there on your right in the map. And the red arrows illustrate new flow paths that were introduced as a result of levee breaching up in the upstream end of the floodplain, and also the excavation of a swale and levee breach in the downstream to facilitate the river accessing that floodplain. And so I'm modeling both pre and post restoration conditions, and I'm doing this for a number of different flood types that I've identified for the Cosumnes River, and those are in the table there on your slide. And so these flood types are like your really big, high magnitude, long duration floods that happen in really wet years, like the one we're seeing. We've seen about 2 months of flooding now on the floodplain, so one of these very large events. But also flood types like your early season, late fall, wet up events that just touch the floodplain briefly, versus your longer duration spring snowmelt events. And so now I'm just going to show you a couple examples from my work, and I invite you to take a look at my poster, which is right outside the room here. So something I'd like you to keep in mind as you look at these graphics is that you'll see different effects of restoration depending on the metric you're looking at, so the physical conditions, the location within the floodplain, and also the flood type. So here just a couple relating to area, so looking at total inundated area and also area days, so area summed up over time. You can see that the effects of restoration here, whether you're seeing increases or decreases as a result of restoration, differ depending on which flood type you're looking at and also which metric. And so this helps give a sense of which flood type might give you a bigger bang for your buck, so to speak, or which may be proportionately more impacted by your restoration actions. You can also look at metrics distributed spatially over time. So here we're looking at changes in depth as a result of restoration. So areas in red are indicating areas that have increased in depth as a result of restoration, and areas in blue are areas that have decreased. So you might think that with restoration, you're just going to see an increase in depth everywhere, but that's actually not the case. This helps give a sense of that under certain conditions, under certain flood types, some areas of the floodplain might provide great habitat, but under different flood types, you won't get those same conditions. So in addition to evaluating individual events, I'm also scaling up to entire years. That's important because wet seasons, like the wet years, like the year we're experiencing now, is going to be quite different from the recent drought years we've seen. So here I'm illustrating just 3 different years. So 2011, a very wet year, and this is showing the total number of days inundated for the season. So you can see the differences there in the years. This is important. It's important to be able to evaluate at this annual scale so that we can evaluate whether we're going to be getting conditions frequently enough to get the sort of benefits that we want, or whether other restoration alternatives might be more beneficial. So now to wrap up here with a couple takeaway points, the point that I mentioned earlier, that restoration actions don't produce the same result everywhere for every flood type. And this points to the value of the sort of work that I'm doing in this highly resolved way, being able to look at things in space and time. And then more generally, this is providing new ways for evaluating floodplain inundation characteristics that are relevant to ecosystems. So the metrics and the visualizations that I'm doing provide a clearer picture for interpretation for ecosystem impacts. And then also this provides an avenue for scenario analysis that is important in planning processes. And these scenarios might be the sort of levee breaching scenarios for this restoration project, or potentially environmental flow scenarios below dams or climate change scenarios. And then finally, and importantly, this is needed information for being able to assess habitat availability. So part of my work that's being supported by the fellowship is to quantify habitat availability for Sacramento splittail, and that's something I'm working on now as well. And Sacramento splittail is a native fish that uses this floodplain both for spawning and rearing. And then the final point I'd like you to leave you with is that although my research is directly informing this particular floodplain restoration project, the work I'm doing, the methods I'm developing are directly applicable to other restoration in the Delta and beyond, including perhaps just downstream at the McCormick-Williamson tract that you mentioned earlier. So with that, I'd like to close and thank you all for, oops, I went too far. Thank you all for inviting me here. So yeah, and welcome any questions.
Great, Allison. Great report. Questions? Patrick?
The question you posed, whether there's enough evidence that you have flooding or sufficient inundation to support the work of creating habitat. What's your sense on the
for this project in particular?
Yeah.
For the well, so I'll be evaluating particularly for Sacramento splittail. There's been my work is part of a larger project based out of the Center for Watershed Sciences at UC Davis that did a lot of the monitoring, both hydrologic as well as ecological monitoring for this particular project. And yes, the Sacramento splittail do occupy this floodplain and use it for habitat, and we have seen an increase in that available habitat as a result of the restoration. And so again, my work will be directly quantifying that benefit.
You said, or some other strategy. Is there some other strategy?
So in the planning process for restoration projects, and I think this is what I was implying here, is that in the planning process you might be looking at various different scenarios. So where you place the levee breach, how wide the levee breach is, other design constraints, basically. So being able to look at those different options in the planning process.
Right, so it's sort of tactics or how you do it, not whether you do it.
Right, yeah, so more design characteristics.
As opposed to channelizing the Consumnes River and doing
Right,
something
so that
else.
might be your pre-restoration condition that you'd be
Yeah,
evaluating.
yeah, I got you.
Right,
Okay,
right.
thanks.
Okay, thanks.
Allison, this work is pretty timely because the Water Board is considering increasing or updating the Water Quality Control Plan, which currently is suggesting additional flows in some highly channelized systems. And there are some that would argue that adding more flow without increasing the floodplain inundation might not get the benefit in terms of fish that we're seeking.
Right.
Do you, you talked about scenarios. Is there an integrated model currently available that could do some scenario planning with in-stream flows and offer different scenarios for floodplain inundation duration and so on?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. I can't say I know for sure what's out there, but I am aware of a number of different hydrodynamic models that would have the capacity to be able to look at these various different scenarios. I can't say that I'm aware of one that's on the scale of the whole delta, but certainly models that have been developed for, say, the YOLO bypass would be relevant for being able to explore these different scenarios where, you know, you're notching weirs, for example, to be able to facilitate and facilitate more frequent flooding within floodplains. So.
Okay. Anything else?
Allison, are you going to look at the 1617 Consumnes data as part of your thesis?
I do have the capacity to look at that, and we've been able to keep field measurements going through this season, so it'll be exciting to look at that and see whether the modeling that I'm doing is doing a good job at showing that. So.
Yeah, you certainly have a pretty extreme end number.
Right.
Yeah, not only do you have a considerable amount of water, but you've got a freight train that's stacked up out there with one car sticking up in the air. All right.
I just want to take the opportunity to thank you, Allison, but also that this is just a great opportunity to see that when we bring before the council these agenda items to approve funding for Delta Science Fellows and other activities, I mean, these are your dollars at work.
Good point. Thank you.
Okay, I have three more items, and then by the numbers. So the three other items I want to go through quickly. One of them is a forum that was held on January 31st that looked at primary production in the Delta, pre-European, and current conditions and conditions that would exist after different levels of restoration were done. The fundamental basis for this work, the document that Allison was part of writing, we have one of the most complete historical, ecological documents on any area that I know of in the United States for the Delta due to this work. It allows us to ask questions about what kinds of primary producers were in the Delta historically, how much of it was in different types of habitat, how much was riparian, how much was tidal wetland, how much of it was occasionally inundated floodplain, backwater sloughs, things of that type. And then the question is, how is primary production now distributed across the Delta currently? And then how will some of our changes that we're intending to do with some of the eco-restore projects, for example, how is that going to shift conditions into the future? And this is something that has rarely been done quantitatively, and this document, along with some of our current information, allows us to do a quantitative estimate of that. And so there's been an ongoing effort for about 18 months to do that process. The meeting that was held on the 31st of January was actually an opportunity to present that information to people who might be interested in utilizing some of that information in ongoing planning. So it was an attempt to try to link up some of the managers and policymakers with some of the scientists who are doing the work. And so this is we had a nice forum, nice discussion, and ultimately kind of next steps are being considered to try to make this scientific research more usable by some of the planners and by some of the decision makers. We also had, on the very same day, a symposium at UC Davis on contaminants. Contaminants are one of the many stressors that exist within the Delta. There's been a lot of discussion of the role of contaminants. One of the chapters of the State of Bay Delta Science that was published is a chapter on contaminants. One of the things that this symposium particularly focused on is that we often think about contaminants on an individual contaminant by contaminant basis. So you'll hear things about the effects of mercury, or you might hear something about the effects of a specific herbicide or pesticide. This symposium, or this really focused on how do we assess the effects of multiple interacting stressors. And so there are some new methodologies, some new tools that are based in molecular biology that allow questions to be asked about how a suite of contaminants might be affecting different biotic organisms within the Delta. And so the focus of this forum was to discuss some of these current state-of-the-art methodologies and talk a little bit about how they might be applied within the Delta. And that was held also on the 31st of January, and the talks and the symposium is online, and I provided a link for you in case you're interested. Finally, monthly, for the new members, I select a paper that I think might be of interest to you from the current scientific literature. And I selected one this month that recently was published in Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment. This is a paper actually not looking at California, but looking at the Rio Grande River Basin and the Colorado River Basin. The paper is written by a hydrologist from the university, or from Arizona State University, whose name is John Sabo, and fish ecologist from the University of Washington, whose name is Julian Olden, and a young Spanish postdoc that I met actually in Spain when he was doing his PhD, who's now here in the United States, who's worked in arid and semi-arid and Mediterranean climates for most of his career, and is kind of a guru at using some new statistical methodologies. The question that this group was asking, and I think it's a very important question, is we've spent a lot of time talking about how much water, how much flows, how much water does a river need to be healthy. It's a hard question. It's a difficult question. It's probably not the same answer for every system, but it is something that is of great interest relative to trying to understand and uncouple some of the population dynamics of fish communities versus some of the hydrologic changes that are occurring in various catchments on a regional scale. So this is a regional study. They got data from 16 different river systems in either the Rio Grande system or in the Colorado River system. They have 20 years of monthly fish population data, and then they have good hydrology data from U.S. Geological Survey gauging stations. So they took these long-term records. Most of the catchments were showing declining flows during that period of time, and then asked the question, how do native and non-native fishes respond to these decreasing flows as a function of time, in this case a 20-year time window. So this was the study, and the results basically point in the direction that probably intuitively you would think is true, and that is that the native fish populations tend to be more affected by decreases in flow than do the non-native fish species. So some of the non-native introduced species have found these changing conditions to be to their benefit. Some of the native species have found these changing conditions not to be conducive for their life histories. And so this is a broad scale look at this question of how declining flows in various river catchments are affecting native and non-native fish populations. It's one of the more thorough studies I've seen on this topic, and I thought it might be of interest to just highlight this to you. And The next thing I'd like to do is we also have a new staff member in the science program. I want to introduce Catherine Courtier. Catherine, I'm going to wave at you. She comes to us from Scripps Institution of Oceanography, where she just recently finished her master's degree. She is going to be with us for a year. She will be presenting to you starting next month by the numbers. So she'll be our new by the numbers presenter, and she'll also play an important role in helping me with putting together a lot of the information that I provide for you, and so she will help with the lead scientist report. She has an interesting background, international work and work on conservation, marine mostly focused, very interested though in becoming much more conversant and learning much more about the Delta. So welcome, Catherine. We're glad to have you here, and we'll, I think, all benefit from her interest, background, and productivity over the next year. So finally, I'd like to have Sam Harrider come up and give you the by the numbers presentation. I wanted to say one thing before Sam starts, and that is this will probably be the last time that you get to interact with Sam. Sam is retiring at the end of March, and he's been a stalwart, and he's been just a key part of the council and the science program, and we're going to miss him, but do want to give him a chance to tell you about some very interesting and very exciting changes in our water supply and some of our fish communities.
It's also the last time he has to wear a suit.
Probably so.
Well, I had to use it sometime, yeah.
Sam, please.
Good morning, Chair Fiorini and members of the council. Thanks for having me here. I think we have some slides. We can get those up. So, well, you're going to get presentation whiplash. You get the old guy this time, and then the new generation next time. So, I'm going to go over the precipitation numbers fairly quickly. You all know that we've had a lot of rain. I want to try to give you a little bit of context about how much rain that really is. So this month's Northern Sierra Index, this is the 8 stations in the northern part of the Sierra where Shasta and Oroville are, stands at 76 inches. That's 230% of average for the state. And to give it a little perspective, if we did not have any more rain at all between now and September 30th of 2017, this would be the 7th wettest year on record out of 95 years. So it's hard to grasp how much that is. We're 20 inches or so over the previous record. And if we had average rainfall over the rest of the year to September 30th, this would set the record easily. We would be something like 92 plus inches, and the previous record's 88 inches. So it's hard to really grasp how much water that is. The Central Sierra and the Southern Sierra both have benefited from that rainfall, and I guess I get to do this, don't I? So that's the, whoops, I'm in snowfall. Oh, Central Sierra is at 60 inches. That's also 230% of average. I'm showing my amateur status here, not knowing how to do this. So, I'll talk a little bit about snowpack. It's also very good. This is going to serve us well throughout the rest of the spring and summer. It's somewhere between 154% and 191% of average, depending on what part of the Sierra you look at or statewide. Let's take a look at reservoir storage. Well, it's all in the green. Reservoir storage is great. I think what these numbers don't really reflect very well, we've heard from Jessica earlier, is that these reservoirs are all essentially full. They're all either at their flood storage level or above and are managing to control flooding downstream. So you couldn't hold back much more water if you had to. San Luis Reservoir, which is the bottom there, is the biggest south of Delta storage reservoir, is right very close to its 2 million acre feet limit, so it's essentially full. And I thought it was interesting looking at DWR's daily reports on Delta is that they're saying that the and actually this is probably a flow number, so I should talk about that. But they're talking about the pumping from the state and federal water projects. And I don't think I've ever seen this before, but they're limiting the amount of pumping because of capacity management, which means that they just don't have any place to put it right now or can't get it to storage. So telling people South Delta, you want some water, and they're saying, no thanks, we've got enough. So,
Yeah, that happened in 2011.
yeah, it doesn't happen very often. Flows, Sacramento River's at 80 plus thousand CFS for the month so far. San Joaquin's very high too. This is not something that happens very often either. It's 20-something thousand acre feet or cubic feet per second for the month. One thing that these numbers don't really show, though, is that we aren't capturing the water that goes through the oil bypass. So the actual numbers for delta inflow and delta outflow are greater than 300,000 cubic feet per second right now, which is a pretty astonishing number. So fresh water is all the way out into San Pablo Bay somewhere right now. It's a pretty impressive amount of outflow. Salinity is very low throughout the system. I'm still a little bit surprised that it still goes up a little bit at the pumps, but there's a little bit of residual salinity in the delta, I think, that contributes to that. But those are good numbers. A couple of fish numbers, and these are actually, we compare these to year over year. These will give you a bit of a snapshot of where we are at this point in the year for a couple of the important delta species. This is the number for delta smelt. This is on the back of your sheet, actually. And this is for the January and February total of the spring Kodiak trawl. And this is an index of how many adult delta smelt are in the system. They'll be spawning this spring. They have a 1-year life cycle. And it's kind of an indicator of how good the conditions were over the past year. But the number is still in the red. It's 26. I would say it's slightly less dismal than last year. It's double what we had last year at this time. It was 13 last year. It's 26. So I guess that's an improvement, but it's still very low compared to historical numbers. The next number I'm going to show is these are for winter run Chinook salmon juveniles. These are the little guys that got spawned last spring, in spring of 2016, and reared over in the Sacramento River over the summer, and they are trapped at Red Bluff, where Red Bluff Diversion Dam used to be, and rotary screw trap. And this number is an indicator of how what the conditions were like for spawning and rearing in the Sacramento River last year. And a lot of it's affected by temperature control. And this number, 523,000, is still fairly low, very low compared to the historical average of 2 million, but it's a little bit better than the 400 and something thousand that we had last year. So with that, I'm done.
Questions of Sam? Yes, Ken?
Sure.
Yeah, the smelt numbers, is anybody, I'm sure they're not claiming credit for the resiliency plan, but, it seems like, again, we've got sort of this great data point of a very wet year to see if that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think we have to wait and see what happens through the year. The benefits of this wet year will probably show up later in the year when you start seeing numbers like the smelt larval survey or the 20 millimeter survey later in the spring. That's an indicator of how successful they've been at spawning and rearing. And one of the challenges with fish numbers is that there's two parts of it that depend on how many fish you started with, how many there were available to spawn, and then how good the conditions were. So it tends to take time to build up that population. So we're hoping that there'll be a bounce in smelt numbers this year, like there was in 2011. It was a very good year, 2011, the last time we had a really good wet year, but it kind of remains to be seen. So.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure.
Anything else? Sam, since this is your last time before us, I just want to personally thank you for all you've done to help me. Being in the office every week, I have the privilege of working with very talented people, and I've relied on Sam a lot, asking him questions and advice, and I just really appreciate your calm demeanor. Nothing seems to get under your skin or rile you up. You just have a real steady approach, and I've always appreciated that. Very knowledgeable, very helpful to me. So it's nice that you can provide us your final report with all this green after years of poor and bad.
I planned it that way.
It was good timing. So thank you very much.
All right, well, thanks for those kind words. I appreciate it. Thank you.
So that concludes the lead scientist report. I also want to say thank you to Allison for coming and presenting, and Sam both for the presentation and for his years of service.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you both very much. And thank you, Cliff. Any requests for comments? Lead scientist report, nothing controversial apparently, Cliff, so thank you. Speaking of retirement, I see in the audience Hank Nordoff, former council member who snuck in the side door. Hank, you've come to celebrate all this rainfall that we're having in Northern California? Okay, great. Good to see you. Okay, now we're on to file item number 9, the last file item before we break for lunch. Dr. J. Lund, Delta Independent Science Report, recent accomplishments and upcoming activities. We may take one more item after you're finished. So.
Chair Fiorini and members of the council, thank you for having me here. I want to report a little bit on what we've been doing with the Delta Independent Science Board and reflect on your wisdom of having us right at this time so I don't profess for too long before lunch. That's always wise. I thought I should begin with just a couple of minutes on what the Science Board is, since we have a couple of new council members here. The Delta Independent Science Board is in this 2009 statute. We have 10 part-time members. 7 of us are from outside of California, and 3 of us are from inside of California. We cover wide ranges of technical expertise, from ecosystems to water quality. We have an economist, a couple of different engineers, so a pretty wide waterfront in terms of expertise, all of which are really pretty nationally well known. In statute, we have several different roles in the legislation, one of which is to review the BDCP and EIR EIS, which we've, on our last iteration of that now, we've reviewed it 3 or 4 times now. We're supposed to review all of Delta Science every 4 years. You can imagine how busy that would keep us, and it's really hard to keep up. And we also are available to assess the best available science on various topics. And so we often get asked by the council or by the Water Resources Control Board to assess particular scientific reports. And we try to assess those to decide if we want to, if we can be helpful in reviewing those documents or if the other folks should do that. And then the individual members of the Science Board also have various activities that we do that sometimes help out with the science program. Go through a little bit of the work products that we've had this last year, which are a part of your board packet. I'll just go through your handout a little bit. We had a major report on adaptive management and the effectiveness of adaptive management for managing the Delta. In addition to that, we have a paper that's coming out fairly soon, we hope in the coming months, on adaptive management. We'll have that in the Estuary Journal that the council supports. That I think is very important because it sort of integrates all of the different aspects of science and how we try to bring that together and apply it to decision making. The legislation, various items of legislation in California require that we do adaptive management, and sometimes it seems like what we mostly do is spell it correctly. And so we tried to assess, well, what do we really mean by adaptive management, and how well are we doing it, and how could we make it better? So that I think it's one of our more important reports in the long run. We have had a very nice workshop on effectiveness on science and for levee reliability in earthquakes and floods. We have a nice little summary report of that workshop that sort of can bring people a little bit up to date on the science behind levee reliability. We had a small review at the request of the council on the process of refining and updating the Delta Plan performance measures. We had a prospectus, which we've now moved on into actually conducting the water quality review. So one of the areas of best available science we want to get around to. We had a letter that we sent off to Council, the Department of Water Resources, and the State Water Resources Control Board requesting more systematic studies of the effects of delta barriers on delta-wide salinity. What we tend to have in the delta is every little agency, or every big agency, and sometimes different programs within an agency will do separate studies on effects of this or that on delta salinity, but it seems to us that it would be valuable to have a smaller number of more comprehensive studies on that subject that would bring everyone's education, everybody's thinking up to a similar plane rather than hitting it in lots of little one-off studies. And we had a very nice letter of accolades on the 2016 Delta Science Conference and some suggestions on ways to improve that. What you have under here is current and upcoming activities. The first one of those is now done, so we should really move that up to the next one, previous category. We just finished a review of the State Water Resources Control Board's draft scientific basis report for the phase 2 of environmental flows. The report, and we try to do this with most of our reports, we try to keep them fairly mercifully brief. So I think the total report for that was about 8 pages. And then we'll sometimes have some additional comments. Some things that we have on the docket for this coming year is the review, what will be our final review of the final EIS for California Water Fix. We're just starting to do that, and hopefully we'll have that done within a few months. We have several thematic reviews, as part of our quadrennial review of all of Delta science on water quality, the Delta as evolving place, and and then those will be, I think, done this year, and we're starting off on a more comprehensive assessment of Bay Delta monitoring. Most science expenditures for the Delta are for monitoring, and there's always a tension between how much monitoring you want to do for regulatory compliance and what are you going to learn from all this. So monitoring for science so that we better understand the system so that we can make better decisions. And so we want to have this review really assess the whole enterprise, which falls under quite a few different regulatory agencies and project agencies to see, can we get more science and understanding and insights out of all this expenditure for monitoring. That's the ultimate thing, but it's probably our biggest, most difficult review to date because it involves so many different agencies and such large expenditures. And then we expect to do some Delta Plan amendment related reviews, such as conveyance storage and operations and ecosystems, but we'll wait and see what the future has for us. Some of our other activities now and for the next few months will be the Delta Lead Scientist recruitment. We had the first of those. You probably had a little bit of mention of that before. The first of those candidates has come through, and the others will come through in March. And then the other, so just to give you a little pictorial view of all this, you have in your packets, I think, a schematic of what we think we're likely to do when. But we're a bunch of scientists, so don't hold us to it too much. And if you have some other things you think are urgent that we need to look at, then let's have that conversation too. want to keep a little bit of flexibility in this. So this is the projected work plan. It's like so many things. I think we've already hit one of these, so I think we'll do pretty well. Are there any questions?
Questions of Jay? You always present things in such an entertaining way. It's easy
Before
to listen
lunch,
to.
no questions.
Yeah, good. Thanks for the schedule. This is helpful.
Thanks, Jay. And I recall some of these, and like the one on adaptive management was really thorough and I thought quite instructive to all of us. So you have that work done. When you go to look at, as you said, you're starting on the review of the final EIR for water fix. So is that a place that you will apply the lessons and recommendations that you did in the earlier report to evaluating how water fix deals with ecosystem effects?
We'll try to address some of that. Again, we'd like to keep that report. I think as a practical matter, our reports are better if more people read them, and more people will read them if they're shorter. So I think we want to decide what are our most important lessons from this review that we want to bring forth. Jessica has provided us with a list of questions from the council that to make sure we try to address for you all. But our general philosophy will be to try to keep it fairly focused. I'm a little myself. I'm wondering if this is an opportunity for us as an independent, semi-external body to reflect on the larger process of how this community of agencies examines large strategic changes to some of the primary real estate in the system, in a sense. It seems like that might be an opportunity that we might want to make some comments that are a little bit broader on that, maybe going beyond our charge in some ways. But
Well, would you be doing that kind of thing in that review of the EIR, or, for instance, the council may be reviewing water fix, as a covered action?
We could make comments anytime someone asks us, or anytime we feel like commenting. So you tell us what's best, and because I would like.
Are you feeling lucky?
I've got tenures at the University of California, so I'm okay. I just mostly want to make sure that the work we do is useful for people that have to make these hard decisions in a very difficult interagency environment.
So just to jump in, what Randy and I had asked the ISB for is to review the final EIR really with an eye towards, were your comments responded to adequately, because they had provided previous review and comments. Now, of course, that's guidance. It's not a limitation on what they can say. There is no formal state comment period on that document, so really that letter's for the benefit of us to have should WaterFix come before us. On the question of adaptive management and applying lessons learned, my understanding is that while there are aspects of adaptive management in the final EIR, part of that document from WaterFix is forthcoming through other subsequent processes, so we may want to request additional review should it become, relevant.
Right. We're always happy to try to be helpful. One of the things we will review in our review of the final EIR, EIS, is adaptive management. What we know of what they're talking about doing for adaptive management, because that was probably the biggest hole we saw in the previous version, and apparently it's still not completed. So it's important, I think, for us to comment on it to some degree, and then if it comes before us again, we can look at it again with new information.
Anything else, Susan?
Thank you very much, Jay, for your report. I'm curious on the comprehensive assessment of the Bay Delta monitoring, and from your schedule, it looks like it'll be finished end of 2018.
Right.
I think that, I mean, this is exciting, and I'm wondering, do you think it would inform the implementation of the DOD bill, which is requiring data transparency and integration?
That issue has come up a little bit. One of the problems with monitoring is getting the data together, getting it standardized and available to people, and then trying to make sense of it. What do we learn from all these piles of numbers that we collect? So that will be one aspect of what we'll try to get to, I'm sure. This is going to be a pretty difficult review because it covers so many different agencies and aspects of. Just think of the wide range of things you would want to you can monitor for something as complex as the Delta. It's a little frightening, but it's really important.
Yeah, it's good you're taking it on. Anything else? All right. Jay, thank you for coming. Stick around. We've got more to come. Jessica, what kind of time do we need to allot for file item number 10?
Well, of course, it always depends on questions of the council, but my presentation is short, and I will make staff available for questions only, but the only presentation is mine.
Okay. Yeah, you all good to go for another 20 minutes before we break for lunch?
Or less.
Or less? Okay, good. No one, yeah, I brought some food in case you're really hungry. Okay, so file item number 10, 2017 priorities.
Okay, thank you. Well, last month we reported out on accomplishments for 2016. We presented our annual report that highlighted council activities as well as activities of other agencies that are operating in the Delta and implementing the Delta Plan. So today we're presenting staff's work plan for 2017. And there's a spreadsheet in your binder, agenda item 10, attachment 1, two-sided document that includes major initiatives for this year and provides the framework for continued progress towards our mission of furthering the co-equal goals. So the work plan is organized by the major themes of advancing the implementation of the Delta Plan and the Delta Science Plan. It really illustrates the broad range of issues and activities that are affected by our role of providing a long-term vision for the Delta and also ensuring that management decisions are based on best available science. In the interest of time, I won't present each activity individually, and many of these are familiar to you. We've either discussed them at recent council meetings or you've even acted on portions of them already as they continue over from last year. However, I will highlight a handful of planned actions for each division and then invite questions should you have any. So our planning division will be focused this year on Delta Plan amendments, including conveyance, storage, and operations, which we'll be talking about after lunch, and completion of the Delta Levees investment strategy, which is on tomorrow's agenda. In addition, staff will continue to work with its agency partners, including Fish and Wildlife, Natural Resources Agency, the Delta Conservancy, and more on ecosystem restoration planning and implementation efforts, including both the Delta Conservation Framework, which is being led by Fish and Wildlife, and the YOLO Bypass Partnership. On the Delta's Place front, staff will participate in the Delta Protection Commission's Delta's Place work group, as well as co-host a workshop with the Commission for local Delta planners to collaborate on land use planning, particularly with respect to climate adaptation. And in order to ensure that the Council can accurately track Delta Plan implementation progress, we are refining and improving specific Delta Plan performance measures, an effort that will include public workshops as early as next month and external science expert review. For the Delta Science Program, there are a number of equally challenging and exciting endeavors planned for this year. In support of the One Delta, One Science vision, a shared science agenda is going to be completed this year, which will build on our work to prioritize science actions across agencies in order to best support management decisions in the Delta. Additionally, we'll lend the expertise of our science program staff to complete an adaptive management framework for the 16 eco-restore projects. in partnership with the Natural Resources Agency, as well as working with the Independent Science Board and others on 2 key efforts to advance the state of delta monitoring. And to advance high-impact science in the Delta, we will fund a number of critical science investigations, including an interagency effort led by Dr. Dom to characterize baseline conditions in the Sacramento River prior to the pending major upgrade of the Sacramento County Regional Wastewater Treatment Plant. We've been affectionately calling that Operation Baseline. We also plan to publish a lessons learned white paper on drought impacts on the Delta. One element that's going to continue to be a point of emphasis for our work in 2017 is our role in supporting and providing leadership for interagency efforts. Given the multidimensional aspect of Delta issues, these collaborations are really essential for how we do our job. And then, of course, the staff report goes into a little bit more detail than I will on what we call our core functions. While it seems like a lot on this double-sided page, that doesn't even reflect kind of the day-to-day work to keep the Delta Stewardship Council up and running and to make it an accessible agency. And so that includes implementing Delta Plan and Delta Science Plan on a daily basis, facilitating peer reviews, assembling expert panels, ongoing engagement on covered actions, preparing comment letters, early consultations, preparation for potential appeals, and furthermore, building our communications and outreach capacity. And we'll continue to provide high-quality meeting services, support, and webcasting, not only our council meetings, but now our Independent Science Board meetings, and the twice yearly DPIC meetings, the Interagency Committee, and much, much more. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have, and I might call upon staff if we want to get into the detail.
Mm-hmm. Questions of Jessica?
Jessica, I was trying to quickly catch where you referenced in your comments the finishing up the ecosystem report that's sort of following on what the governor's efforts are. It just strikes me as an example of a really hard thing to do that's very important, which is figuring out where do we go from here. They're doing a lot of good projects at Fish and Wildlife and with other agencies and so forth, but to figure out where to go next and how to do it comprehensively is hard to do, as those of us who have gone to public meetings have seen, and your staff sees all the time. So I just note that the council has a really good staff, and for new members, calling on them through Jessica for advice and information really pays off. And some of these tasks are less obvious or less controversial, but really fulfill the legislature's requirement that Mike knows well of 2009 to pursue the co-equal goals with a sense of place of the Delta. So this work plan, I know, continues a lot of what you're doing, but embedded in it are some really hard jobs.
Absolutely, thank you. And on that topic, I mean, there's a number of fronts that will be active on restoration this year. We've been active for the past few months in developing this adaptive management white paper and strategy for eco-restore. And the reason why that matters is because these are 16 projects that aren't all connected. And we stand to we already have, in fact, restored more acreage in the Delta over the past few years than we have in decades. So this really presents an opportunity to learn a ton from those restoration projects and to do them and structure them in a way that we can adapt them to optimize the goals that we have in mind. And that adaptive management strategy would not be happening had the Reform Act not highlighted the importance of adaptive management and had the council not amended it into the plan as a requirement. So we've really, I think, stepped up in a leadership role there. Now, all that and all the work that the Fish and Wildlife and the Conservancy and other agencies working on restoration is doing to develop this conservation framework is intended to feed into a Delta Plan amendment on ecosystem restoration, which we're thinking about now and scoping now, but given everything else on our plate, we hope to really launch at the end of this year. And so that will give us an opportunity to even take things further than they are now.
Other questions or comments? All right, I just want to echo Patrick's observation. We have a really hard-working team. It's a small agency, and we do a lot with a few people because they're so talented and working hard. And I just want to highlight Jessica's leadership and her guidance of the staff. This is an ambitious set of priorities, but it's our job, and I appreciate your leadership and everyone involved in their commitment to getting it done. So thank you for all of your support of us. Is there any request for comments on file item number 10? I think I asked for 20 minutes. How long will the next item take? I think maybe we better break for lunch. It looks like it's going to take more than 10 minutes. All right, we're going to recess for lunch, and we'll reconvene at 1 o'clock. That's in 50 minutes. I want you to know I forgot to bring the almonds, so I bought those last night. Apparently I underbought. Okay. All right, everybody grab a seat. No, he didn't. We're on. All right. Welcome back. Hope everyone had a good lunch. We are reconvening and picking up where we left off with file item number 11. Topic is an update regarding the water fix Delta Water Conveyance project. Jessica?
Okay, thank you. And you'll notice that Dan Constable from our staff is coming to the table, and he will provide the update. Thanks.
Welcome, Dan.
Thank you. Is this on? Great. Chair Fiorini, council members, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to be giving an update on agenda item 11. This is an update on Cal Water Fix. I'll give a short overview just going through the document today, and then there'll be some time for questions if you have any afterwards. So I think everyone here is probably quite familiar. You've been around for a while and understand this project very well. But just to go through it quickly, this is the new, WaterFix is the new preferred alternative under the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, under BDCP. It's also known as Alternative 4A. As you may remember, when BDCP was originally proposed, the regulatory environment was going to be approached through a NCCP HCP. In 2015, that was changed due to some uncertainties in how the 50-year time frame.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman. For our vast television audience, would you actually say the words?
Sure. For the acronyms, I will do that. Thank you for the suggestion. So this was under. We'll go back from the beginning. When the BDCP Bay Delta Conservation Plan was originally proposed, This was going to go forward under what is called a natural community conservation plan and habitat conservation plan. Under the terms of that, there was going to be a 50-year permit granted, kind of a no surprises approach. In 2015, the approach was changed due to some uncertainties in how that might work out. Some of the ecological uncertainties and comments were raised, and a new regulatory approach was proposed. This new alternative is 4A, it's also known as water fix. This would be a different regulatory approach. Instead of the Natural Conservation Community Plan, NCCP, and Habitat Conservation Plan, HCP, it would go through the Federal Endangered Species Act under Section 7 and under California Department of Fish and Wildlife under what's called an incidental take permit 2081B. So this would be a different approach. Many aspects of Alternative 4A are quite similar to BDCP. For example, under Alternative 4, the water conveyance approach is more or less the same. There are not significant changes there. The one big change is it does not approach the habitat component because of the change in regulatory approach. So many of what were referred to as conservation measures, those are no longer included in water fix. There's a separate process, I'm sure you're aware of, Eco-Restore, that would address parts of those. And instead, water fix is now primarily a water conveyance project, and it includes some what are now called environmental commitments that take select parts of those conservation measures, but certainly not the majority. One thing that we're talking about today is the relevance to the council, and one reason we wanted to bring this up today is that DWR has indicated that this could be a covered action, in which case it would come before you, and it would go through the whole covered action process. So that's why we're bringing it up here today. I did want to note one part on here. If you go down to the first page here on Agenda 11, under Preferred Alternative and Major Changes Resulting from BDCP to Water Fix Transition, it looks like there was a typo there. There was a track change, I think, that wasn't accepted or had gone back. On the first line there, it says, as part of Water Fix, DWR proposes to construct 3 new pumping stations. That was supposed to read 3 new North Delta diversions and 2 pumping stations. One of the significant changes, again, under from BDCP to the preferred alternative under here, was that it would be gravity fed from the new North Delta diversions. There would be 2 new pumping plants at Clifton Court 4 Bay, but not at the North Delta. If you turn to the next page here, this gives an overview of some of the more significant changes. So again, under Water Fix, the water conveyance components of the project are more or less the same under both Bay Delta Conservation Plan Alternative 4 and the new preferred alternative, Alternative 4A. They both propose 3 new North Delta diversion points. They both would use dual conveyance. Both have 2 by 40 foot by approximately 35 mile long tunnels running through the delta. They both would have a maximum diversion capacity of 9,000 CFS through these tunnels, so there's no change there. One change there are is the operational scenarios that have been proposed. So under BDCP Alternative 4, they used what was called a decision tree, and then there was a series of scenarios. There's actually scenario H that was defined by sub-scenarios under that. There's a little footnote here that refers to the bottom that explains a little bit more about what those are. I won't go into the details of the decision tree, but this was one part that came up before, is that some of this was to be deferred to the future. So this decision tree was going to have some hypotheses, how this would affect fisheries, for example. Those would be addressed through the fisheries services, and then the flow would be adjusted as needed, kind of seeing how the outcomes are. Under the new alternative 4A, it would still be dual conveyance. So this is meaning you would use these North Delta diversions. You would still use the South Delta diversion too under some circumstances. The operational scenario that's being used here for modeling purposes is called H3+. This is quite similar to H3. It basically adds an additional spring outflow component. One thing to note here is that these are the operation scenarios that are used for modeling. This doesn't mean this is what actually would exactly be done. That would be determined somewhat by the process that's coming out of the biological opinions that are undergoing consultation right now. And then the actual day-to-day real-time operations would be informed by this, but they could differ. So if you have an extreme event, if you have salinity intrusion or another event like that, that would be informed by real-time operations, obviously. But these are the scenarios that are used for modeling purposes, and this is what's in the environmental impact report, so that's what we look at. One thing I think that would be of interest, if you look in the next line here, it talks about the total potential changes in water exports. So this is through the State Water Project and Central Valley Project. This is compared to what's called the no action alternative. And the no action alternative is not the same as doing nothing. This is an assumption that if you are moving forward in the future, what was the situation look like? It incorporates climate change. It incorporates other actions that were going to be expected to occur as of 2009, things that were already planned. This is for the early long term. So this is 15 years after the project would be, we thought would be approved maybe. That would be around 2025. Obviously that's not really 15 years now, but that's what the modeling is based off of. There aren't huge changes here. Under BDCP Alternative 4, you can see there was quite a range there. It was anywhere from about 27,000 to 814,000 acre-feet more per year over the no action alternative. Under Alternative 4A, this would be made more certain because they've chosen a single operational scenario for modeling purposes. So around 189,000 acre-feet more per year on average. For reference, that's less than is currently exported, which is about 5.1, but it's more than would be expected under if we didn't put the project in, if nothing went ahead, just if climate change and everything else went forward. So it's kind of in the middle there. There's several other changes. I won't go into the details of all of them. I just highlighted a few here. There's been some changes such as the number of barge unloading facilities has been reduced, primarily to reduce impacts in some areas, it seems. Again, as we hit on before, the regulatory approach has changed, so it's no longer under an NCCP HCP. One of the largest changes would be under habitat restoration and mitigation actions. And so if you go down 2 more lines, you'll see under the Bay Delta Conservation Plan as was originally proposed, there was up to 153,000 acres that were going to undergo restoration, which is a quite large number. A bit of that was made up of tidal habitat restoration, so almost 65,000 acres. That has been substantially reduced. Again, this is now more of a water conveyance project. It says up to 13,340 acres here is now proposed. A key part is up to. It could be less than that depending on the actual impacts of the project. So it might not be quite that much. And then on the next line down there, of that number would be 295 acres of tidal habitat restoration. So again, a much different approach. It doesn't have quite the same focus on conservation in this part. Are there any questions on that table before I move on?
Ken?
So the annual export number is an average, and it's based on the H3 plus operating scenario, which was somewhere between, on the decision tree between the low end and the high end, but you said with an additional spring outflow. So, this is the plus 189,000 is compared to the no project baseline in the EIR, or which I believe was sort of the snapshot in time and not kind of looking at, gee, how can things get worse? Are there more restrictions? Or maybe you could sort of explain that, because I think that's a number. I've always thought that looking at this from sort of an average annual number was kind of misleading because it doesn't show where you're capturing the wet year flows and even normal years, the ability to pull more in normal years, and this kind of gets to our CSO amendment. But can you talk a little bit about the assumption that says it's only 189,000 acre feet a year more?
Sure, I can try and hit on that. A couple notes. How it's defined under the EIR for CEQA, the no project alternative and the no action alternative, they're actually using the same assumption. So it's looking towards the future. It is using that early long-term future condition. So it's not it's not compared to existing conditions. It's compared to the no action alternative. As terms of the long-term average, yes, having a single number glosses over a bit of the details, and you really do need to look at both the dry years and the wet years and everything in between. There are some nice figures that were not included in this in the interest of brevity that show that a bit better. But if you look at that, it shows that more water would be taken on wet years on average, and less than is currently taken would be taken in dry years. So in a dry year, there would be less than is currently exported in a dry year right now, and that would be made up for with greater exports during the wet years. So that is true. That is a key point, and that's relevant to the CSO amendment as well.
So just to follow up on this baseline issue. So the baseline that this represents is sort of a future trending baseline that looks at, if you took no action, exports would decrease with South Delta pumping because of, I remember in the BDCP, there was an economic analysis that used this sort of future trending baseline that showed different numbers from what was done under the CEQA and the NEPA baseline. And I don't want to kind of belabor it, but it's important as we start to look at, achieving water supply reliability. Is that what's going on here? I mean, because it's important to see where our starting point is.
Yeah, it's a very good question. The increase there, the additional 189,000 acre feet, is based on the no action alternative, which is an early long term. That is a future condition. It's not compared to current conditions. If you're using current, that baseline, it would actually go down still. I mean, that's less than is currently than the long-term average.
Right. No, I understand that, but it's sort of, well, maybe this is something we can explore elsewhere, but I guess is the feeling that is representative of what the future would be in terms of sole reliance on South Delta pumping.
It's a very good question.
Because I just remember there were different baselines in the BDCP, and it really kind of was significantly different.
Sorry, just to make sure I understand, are you saying if this was the no project alternative, essentially?
Because the BDCP was more than just the EIR, EIS, there was an economic analysis that was conducted that projected a worsening baseline. That it wasn't the baseline that was used, the CEQA, which was really confusing because you had a CEQA baseline, you had a NEPA baseline, and then you had this economic analysis. But I guess maybe where I'm going is that I think when we look at this average number and we look at what the improvement is from current conditions or future conditions, and we have the CSO amendment, I think we have to be really careful in that we don't kind of lose what we're trying to achieve by looking at averages and really understanding sort of what, if we do nothing, if the status quo remains, is it really representative of what they're looking at because you've got all sorts of legal requirements, or is there, could it get worse? That's sort of the issue I'm bringing up.
Okay. Maybe that can be discussed more during CSO as well.
And Ken, would it be helpful if you were to, if the model runs for the H3 plus alternative included very dry, critically dry, average wet, very wet years scenarios?
Yeah, I mean, I think you want to look at that because that's how we're going to see, okay, are we, especially when you look at optimizing operations of all these facilities, I think that's, how you're going to evaluate it.
And then on top of that, it would be interesting to note whether or not whatever the projected additional spring outflow would be under those different hydrologic conditions, if that's a straight line or if it also is adjusted depending on the hydrologic year. I don't know if that information is available, but I think that's what he's asking for.
Okay, that's a good question. We can try and pull that. As it's reported in the EIR, the figures only show certain snapshots. That data is available in the modeling, and you can look at, say, reservoir levels for various different types of years, see how operations might work, see how different water levels might be. If you want to look into more detail at monthly time snaps, something like that, it's all in the models.
Sort of that water year type, and because that gets to the heart of what we're trying to accomplish in the CSO amendment.
Okay, yeah, we could pull that.
Skip.
Thank you, Randy. This is a much easier question, so I'm going to throw this one at you. You had mentioned that during wet years you'll be able to export more water. Wasn't that your statement?
I shouldn't say you will be able to, but that is the operating scenario, that more could be exported in wet years than you otherwise would be able to.
I guess my question is, and I'm sorry if it's a dull question, but if we now are experiencing some of the highest flows that we've seen in many years, and the pumps have had to dial back because there's no place to put this additional water, what are we going to do about additional waters? And I guess it's a big gulp, little sip sort of concept. Where are we going to put this additional water if we have it available?
That question's been raised, and it's an excellent question. It depends on the other conditions. If you don't,
shouldn't there be an answer to that if we're talking about exporting more water out of the Delta? Shouldn't we know where we're going to put it?
Stay tuned for the next agenda item.
Well, I was just priming Dan for the next agenda item.
Yeah, I think it's highly relevant to the CSO amendment and to the co-equal goals overall, trying to increase water reliability while protecting the environment as well. It's a great question. From the point of view of the project, how it's written, it's focused on conveyance as a limiting factor. If you didn't have anywhere to put the water, say all of south of Delta water storage was full, or if the conveyance infrastructure is already at full capacity, the pumps can only pump so much. If you're not going to really go beyond that if the water is there and there's no storage. It does not look at storage. The modeling does consider how storage would operate to some degree, but during the water board hearings, which I'll talk about in a minute, this question was brought up, and DWR mentioned they did look at some south of Delta storage locations, and that there didn't seem to be a significant difference, so they didn't model in detail for all the locations. But yes, theoretically in certain year types you could have combinations, I suppose, where, say, this coming spring, where your storage is quite full, and maybe the project wouldn't be operating to its full capacity. Yeah. Okay, I'm flipping to the next page here. This is page 3 of agenda item 3. I'm just going to quickly go over some of the anticipated timelines. So as you know, in the latest reincarnation, it's now over 10 years of the planning process, was restarted in 2006. It's been very difficult to predict exact timelines. Things have changed a bit, and as you saw in 2015, the regulatory approach completely changed. So that can be quite difficult, but we're trying to put together a general timeline for our own understanding, and so I'll go through that quickly, and then some of the other processes that are relevant to this. So right now, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service, NIMS, are in consultation to put together the final biological opinions. These are important for a number of reasons. For one, they would help determine how future operating criteria would be developed and implemented. They're also important because a record of determination and notice of determination to finalize this final EIR depends on this being available. So this is going through right now. My understanding is that they expect this to be concluded by April of this year. That may change, but that's the latest I had heard. They're going through March, April right now. This is also important because the State Water Board has said that Part 2 of their current hearing, which I'll get to in 1 minute, can't start until there is a final BIOP. If, as part of this too, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, if it met all their conditions, they could issue a 2081B. This is an incidental take permit, and that would also be required. I've heard various estimates for that, but it should be along the same timeline, so probably by April of this year. Again, that's a different agency. They're going through their own processes. We can't guarantee that, and we don't know. An important process that's been going on for some time now is the change in point of diversion petition. This has been submitted to the State Water Resources Control Board. This is going through, in order to put in these 3 new points of diversion in the North Delta, they need this from the State Water Board. This was actually originally started, I believe, in April of last year, and the hearing was delayed, and then it's restarted in July. July 26th is when it actually officially started. This hearing has been split into 2 parts, Part 1 and Part 2. Part 1 has been further divided, and Part 1A was the petitioners, so this was DWR and Reclamation presenting their case in chief, so presenting their project. Part 1B has been everyone else. That's primarily NGOs and other groups who might be characterized as not as supportive of the project, but it also includes groups like Wetlands and others who have expressed support. So it's really just everyone else besides the actual petitioners. The day before yesterday, the Water Board issued a ruling that this has been slightly delayed. It was originally, Part 1B was originally supposed to be finished in January, so last month. It's now on hold, and it will restart on April 25th of this year. They've scheduled dates up to August 10th of 2017 for the continuation of Part 1. My guess, and again, this is the State Water Board, we certainly don't know their schedule, but my guess is that they would not use that entire time because they are originally assuming they would finish all of Part 1 in a few days in the end of January, and about 2 weeks of total hearing dates. We don't know what will happen with that, but it could go well into 2017. This is important for the council because we would assume that DWR would not submit a certification of consistency to the council before having a determination from the Water Board and getting a Section 401 permit under the Clean Water Act. If Part 1 is delayed well into 2017, I would expect a further delay of Part 2, and then after Part 2, the Water Board could issue that determination. So we don't know the exact timing on that, but I would expect at least late 2017, and we'll have to stay tuned to see how that turns out.
Dan, can I interrupt? Can you remind the council members what Part 1 and Part 2 are covering?
Yes, sorry. Part 1, again, was split into 2 parts. Part 1 is essentially injury to water rights holders. If you were to experience an injury. So this is primarily a lot of agricultural water users bringing up issues like D1641, impacts to water quality, things like that. Part 2 is a whole slew of issues, but I guess I would characterize it broadly as the more environmental aspects. Part 2 is probably more relevant to the council as well. It also includes public interests. So this would be things relevant to the co-equal goals. It would involve impacts to fisheries. There are some other, I guess you could say, beneficial uses like recreation that would also be covered under that as well. Yeah. Moving on from that, from terms of council activities, we've offered early consultation to the Department of Water Resources. That's something that we offer to any party planning a project in the Delta. Early consultation is essentially us explaining the Delta Plan, explaining the Delta Plan policies, how they might be relevant. We offer this in an effort to make what the council does more transparent and to help people understand what they might expect if they do determine that their action is a covered action. Since DWR has implied that they may consider that and they may certify, we think that's very important. That process is still ongoing. Obviously, with some of the recent events in Oroville and other things this winter, I'm sure they're swamped, but we hope to continue that this year.
Dan, do you have any estimate of what the administrative record would be like in terms of the number of pages if a certificate of consistency were to be appealed and we'd have to process that?
Yes, we were joking that we might have a new metric like number of trucks that would back up to the building. That's actually, it raises an important point, is that the EIR that we're looking at right now is not the same as what we would necessarily see in a certification of consistency. We would assume other materials, such as all the materials that are coming out of the State Water Resources Control Board hearing, would also be incorporated. Any appellants would bring in their own documentation. Considering the EIR is at about 97,000 pages, and the evidence that's been submitted to the Water Board so far is, well, not that much, but it's in the tens of thousands of pages, I'd estimate, in total too. Yeah, I don't know, hopefully less than 200,000 pages, but it shows the amount of information that's coming to us, and it's why we're looking at this already right now, is that we'd really like to understand what could be coming in the future and have a very good understanding of the project as best as we can to date.
That would suggest that early consultation is critical, because I think our process, if I recall, is 120 or 130 days for the appeals process.
The appellate process, so were the consistency determination to be appealed, the council's regulations run from day 0 to day 120 when any determination the council makes would be adopted.
Okay.
Yes, it's of the utmost importance, and it would be a very, very large record, we'd anticipate.
Yeah, it's not on our priority list for 2017.
Well, I did mention a core function was maintaining vigilance and preparations for appeals.
There's some additional permits that would also be required. So I mentioned the Section 401, so that would come from the Water Board in the case of California. This, as I understand, would be issued separately by an executive officer there, but it would not be issued, if it is issued, until after the record for the current change in point of diversion petition closes. So not that they would have a determination, but that all their evidence is in at least. So that I would anticipate would at least be late 2017. Some of the other permits here, Clean Water Act 404 and 408, are unknown at this point in time. An example of 408, it's common practice that they would have at least, say, 80, 90% or 100% design in order to have that issued.
Probably better explain the 404 and the 408 permits. What do they cover?
I'm actually probably not the best person to explain that, since I'm not an engineer, but these are all under the Clean Water Act. 408, I believe, is under the core. Well, it's related to flood safety, to levees, if you're going to impact a levee as part of this. This is why the Corps wants a very clear understanding of what you're actually going to build. I'm not sure if someone can give a better explanation of 404. Yeah. Again, the timelines on these aren't quite clear. The project, as of, I guess, earlier this year, or end of last year, when they issued a preliminary design, that was a 10% level design. So quite a bit would have to change. So this could be anywhere from in the next year to, say, 2020, depending on how they move forward and the speed of all the other activities. So I would say that's a different timeline. That's also not something we'd necessarily need to see at the council, but those are things that would need to go in place before the project were built, obviously. I'm on the next page here now, just going through. This is page 4. As you know, the council has previously submitted comments. They did so on the draft EIR, EIS, and on the partially recirculated draft as well. Some of the issues that brought up in just a very, very broad generalization, there were questions about the roles, rights, and responsibilities of specific agencies, so how people would work together to implement this project if it went ahead. There were many questions about the anticipated approach to adaptive management, so how that would be approached, how adaptive management may operate. There were requests under BDCP to better define the role of the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation and clearly describe funding commitments, again, especially for adaptive management, so that wasn't clear. Under the recirculated draft, many of those were raised again. There were also questions raised about how to best avoid certain impacts or to mitigate for them, so impacts to, say, recreation, impacts to agricultural users in the Delta, local communities, community character, several aspects like that. The Delta Independent Science Board also submitted their own set of comments. Many of these overlap. As you heard from Jay earlier, they had several concerns related to adaptive management. That was one of the big issues that was raised. I should note that in the final EIR, adaptive management still is not a major focus, but that is something that, as I understand, is being developed separately in some ways, and that there will be an addendum or an additional focus on adaptive management that's forthcoming. It's also being looked at under the biological opinions right now, but we don't have a final, what I would call a final adaptive management plan to review at this point. As we're moving forward, staff have been looking through the EIR. As I mentioned, it's about 100,000 pages. We've had assistance from Arcadis to look through this as well. We're trying to see how previous comments may have been addressed and also start relating parts of it to look at our own Delta Plan policies. So things that we're curious about, questions that were raised earlier, how does this relate to certain Delta Plan policies? We're starting to look at that. We should have an update on that, I expect, by the May council meeting. We may have some draft materials available before then. And then lastly, I would note, as has been raised by council members here, that this is extremely relevant to the proposed conveyance, storage, and operations amendment that you'll be discussing in a moment, I believe. Obviously, many of the aspects of WaterFix and CSO are closely interrelated. Depending on the timing for these two projects, it's possible that a CSO amendment could be in and completed before a certification of consistency was submitted, or it could be afterwards. We're not sure at this point in time. And obviously, the exact contents of the CSO amendment are still to be determined to some degree as well. If this does go ahead and DWR submits a certification of consistency to the council, based on comments that have been made over at the Water Board by several parties there, it seems likely that it could be appealed and you would see it as a covered action before you in that case. As Randy alluded, there would be a substantial record that we would have to review, and ultimately that would have to determine the consistency with the Delta Plan. So there's a lot of exciting things happening in the next, well, say a year or two, we're not sure on the timeline, and a lot to look forward. So if there are no further questions right there, I'll conclude and open up to general questions.
Questions for Dan? A compliment. You really have a good handle on a very, very complex set of facts and history and information and projecting ahead. This has been very helpful to hear it all wrapped up and delivered to us and with the historical sense and the current events and what to look forward to. I'm glad you're on this and appreciate the information.
Okay, great, thank you.
Had any requests for public comment? Okay, great. Dan, thank you. Next item, file item 12, consideration of draft Delta Plan amendment regarding conveyance, storage, and operations.
Okay, well, you have a big job. We have a big job. Not only were we given this potential appellate role through virtue of our covered action authority, but the legislature also directed us to promote options for Delta conveyance, storage, and the operations of both. That's what brings us to our discussion today. The staff report provides the detailed background as to why we're embarking on this plan amendment and council activity to date, especially since June of 2015. And in a moment, staff will walk us through the draft. I want to remind everyone that while this amendment takes on an important and complex topic, it must be considered in the overall context of the Delta Plan. It is an amendment to the Delta Plan, and it especially must be considered within the regulatory context of the Delta Plan. By design, the Delta Plan covers a lot of ground. It addresses many policy considerations related to, but also beyond conveyance and storage. including identifying high priority restoration areas in the Delta, advancing restoration strategies, protecting Delta's place values, reducing flood risk, and a raft of Delta-specific water quality recommendations, and more. So considering this amendment without considering the context of the overall plan will be tempting, but it could lead to faulty analysis. Whatever you ultimately endorse becomes part of our overall balancing strategy of furthering the co-equal goals. So I won't belabor this because we just had extensive discussion with Dan's presentation, but any new conveyance or storage project that meets the definition of being a covered action, such as water fix, will be held to the consistency criteria included in the Delta Plan, which is currently 14 regulatory provisions. And these include requirements related to siting of projects, local government consultation, a real and funded adaptive management plan to deal with changing future conditions, demonstration of reliance on the best available science, mitigation and, where possible, avoidance of local impacts, and more. So our Delta Plan currently places heavy emphasis on the problems with the status quo of water management and infrastructure as it affects the Delta. And our plan endorsed the Bay Delta Conservation Planning process, which was ongoing at the time in 2013, which included not only conveyance alternatives, but large restoration targets. So in this discussion draft, which is intended to be responsive to the legislative direction of 85304 in the Water Code, we go further and get more specific in promoting options in the staff draft and in recommending preferred characteristics of new or improved Delta conveyance, storage, and operations in order to address shortcomings of the current systems and to achieve state goals. So the draft has been informed by hours of public conversations that we've had at council meetings and expert input that we've had over the last year plus, which crystallized into the 19 principles you adopted at the end of December 2015. And it reflects extensive staff and consultant review and policy level analysis of various conveyance, storage, and operational alternatives, plans, environmental documents, and more. So with that, I will turn it over to staff and our consultant to walk you through agenda item 12. Cassandra?
Okay. Chair Fiorini and council members, thank you. As Jessica mentioned, we're here today to present the first of what will likely be several discussion drafts related to this amendment process. I wanted to start out by introducing the panel and what we'll be covering today. So we have Anthony Navicero, who has been here and presented to the council before, and he will be going over a little bit of the background to sort of how we got here, what we've done so far. And then Carrie Shively from our Stantec consulting team will be talking a little bit about the analyses that we did to get to the discussion draft and then stepping through the draft itself. And then I will wrap up with a discussion of the body of science that was used to support this amendment language, and then future next steps in public outreach. So before I turn it over to Anthony, I want to point out that we have a few potential items or questions for your consideration during this presentation. So that's in your staff report. So I will go ahead and let Anthony take it.
Thank you, Cassandra. I will provide background for this Delta Plan amendment regarding Delta conveyance system storage and operation of both. To welcome our newest council members, I will begin with the Reform Act of 2009, which established the Delta Stewardship Council and charged the council to develop, adopt, and implement the Delta Plan, a comprehensive, legally enforceable, long-term management plan for the Delta to meet the co-equal goals. As stated per Water Code 85304, the Delta Plan shall promote options for new and improved infrastructure relating to water conveyance in the Delta, storage systems, and for the operation of both to achieve the co-equal goals. Additionally, per Water Code 85320, the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, BDCP, was considered for inclusion in the Delta Plan with caveats. The Delta Plan set a commitment to revisit the inclusion of the BDCP if the process was not completed by January 1st, 2016. So in April 2015, the administration pivoted from BDCP and split their efforts into two alternative projects, California Water Fix and California Eco Restore. Immediately after the pivot, the council was triggered to take action and arrange a series of panels during the spring and summer of 2015, which consisted of subject matter experts and stakeholders to advise the council on potential actions to react to the pivot. The council proceeded to take a two-step approach, to adopt a guiding document and to develop a Delta Plan amendment regarding Delta conveyance system storage and operations of both. In the winter of 2015, the council adopted a problem statement and the 19 principles. Among these other efforts, the council staff also sought and secured funds through a BDC change proposal to hire consultants to assist council staff. In the beginning of 2016, council staff selected a consulting team, formerly NWH and now part of Stantec, to assist council staff in its process to develop a draft amendment. Council staff not only presented the process and progress to developing a proposed amendment over 2016, but also analyzed and evaluated authorities and options to understand the council's role in promoting options. Today, we present the discussion draft language to receive comments and input from the council and the public. And with that, I'll now introduce Carrie Shively.
Good afternoon. So as Anthony described, we took the 19 principles that were adopted by the council in late 2016 and used those to really help us identify the key areas of focus for the Conveyance Storage and Operations Amendment. Using those 19 principles as our guide, a team of planners and scientists got together and we worked to identify some of the fundamental problems that should be addressed and the outcomes that we would like to achieve from an amendment. We looked at a broad array of options, different types of infrastructure in different parts of the state, different mechanisms for water management that could be influenced by different infrastructure options, such as transfers. We also looked at how different facilities could be integrated and operate together to get the most out of those facilities. And I think, as was mentioned in the prior briefing, it's recognized that no single solution is going to solve all of our problems in the Delta. So conveyance alone is not going to solve our problems. It really needs to be a combination of conveyance storage and how we operate them both to get the most effects. We also reviewed the 19 principles through the lens of existing state responsibilities and state authorities. This helped us to kind of identify what the council's role could be, as well as what the role of different state agencies and local implementing agencies could be in implementing and moving forward with conveyance, storage, and operational changes. Using the problem statement that was adopted with the 19 principles as our starting point, we drafted a refined problem statement, which you'll see in the beginning of the amendment, that sought to really articulate the key problems that we were trying to solve with the amendment. This is also consistent with how the Delta Plan is organized and drafted. So the different chapters start with the description of the problem, followed by the identification of different recommendations and/or policies to solve those problems. And last, relevant performance measures were identified that could be used to track progress in conveyance, storage, and operations, which I'll describe in a little bit. So I wanted to take a little bit of time, though, to walk you through the amendment and kind of orient you to how it's organized. It is pretty long and complex. It's concluded as attachment 3 to the staff report, if you'd like to follow along. The draft
I thought it was pretty short, considering.
It could have been much longer. You're absolutely right.
Jessica makes a good point.
I'll try to keep then at least the review brief. How's that? The draft is organized into 3 primary components. So the upfront portion is an introduction and problem statements. The main body, or the second portion, it contains the recommendations related to conveyance, storage, and operations. And then the third part identifies potential performance measures. So I'll walk briefly through each of those. So the introduction and problem statement comprises the first 4 pages. The introduction provides a background on why the council is amending the Delta Plan for conveyance, storage, and operations. And it also provides some of the context for the amendment relative to achieving the co-equal goals, as well as relative to other important state efforts, such as the Governor's California Water Action Plan. The introduction is followed by problem statements that articulate the challenges that we're trying to address with improved Delta conveyance storage and operations. So following the introduction and the problem statement are the draft recommendations themselves, and these are divided up into 3 sections, Roman numerals 1, 2, and 3. Section 1 begins on page 5, and it contains the recommendations related to conveyance. It has 3 items, A, B, and C. Item A describes the specific conveyance options that are being promoted. Item B describes the characteristics or the analytical criteria that different project proponents really should be considering when they're evaluating different options for conveyance. And item C describes the characteristics that should be considered for through Delta conveyance as well. Moving on to section 2, which begins on page 8 of the draft. This contains recommendations related to new and improved water storage. It is also divided into 3 items, A, B, and C, and organized pretty similar to the first section. Item A describes the specific water storage options that are being promoted. These options could be located in the Delta watershed, in the water export area for the Delta. It could include on-stream and off-stream storage, groundwater storage. Item B describes the characteristics and the analytical criteria that project proponents should be considering when they're evaluating new storage projects. And item C describes some specific recommendations related to groundwater. Section 3 begins on page 11, and it has the recommendations for improved operations. The operation of storage and conveyance is a little bit more complicated. We have 5 items in this section, items A through E. Item A describes the options that are being promoted for operations. These options focus on coordinated operations of the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project under a range of differing hydrologic conditions. That's similar to some of the discussion we've had earlier today about how we need a system that can be more flexible and resilient in the face of our ever-changing hydrology. It also identifies the promotion of certain storage and conveyance operations outside the Delta to encourage greater regional self-reliance. Item B describes important considerations for development of operational plans for any new storage and conveyance facilities. So as new facilities are coming online, what are the things that these projects should be thinking about when they're developing their operational plans? Item C makes recommendations to the Water Board for their consideration in updating the upcoming Bay Delta Plan. Item D contains recommendations related to the operation of facilities outside the Delta, but that could also help achieve the co-equal goals. And item E contains recommendations related to data management and transparency, specific to the DOT Act that was discussed earlier today. Last, attachment A to the discussion draft identifies some refined performance measures that would be used to track progress related to conveyance storage and operations. These are part of a larger body of refined performance measures that will be discussed in greater detail at a future council meeting. So with that, I will hand it back to Cassandra to talk a little bit about best available science and our schedule for moving forward.
Okay. I just want to take a few minutes to discuss attachments 2 and 4 of the staff report. So as the council knows, the Delta Reform Act requires the plan to be based on best available science. So to that end, in 2015, to support the development of the 19 principles, the Delta Science Program prepared the draft, or what is it, Delta Plan Summary and New Scientific Findings for Delta Plan Update in Storage, Conveyance, and Operations. That was October 2015, and that is attachment 2 to your staff report. And since that time, additional scientific studies have occurred, and new findings have been made, and new reports have been come out, and so particularly related to climate change and groundwater storage, and that has been compiled by the science program under the lead scientist. And that is a separate report called Updated Scientific Findings for Delta Plan Amendment Concerning Storage, Conveyance, and Operation, February 2017. And that's attachment 4 to your report, and that was used to develop or to support the development of the current amendment. So if you have any questions regarding any of the articles or scientific information in that document, please let Cliff know, And I'm sure the science program staff will be able to answer all of your questions. Finally, I'd like to wrap up with just kind of some next steps. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this is kind of an initial discussion draft developed by staff. It's probably the first of 3 or more drafts that you'll be seeing. So we do have some public workshops scheduled for early March, and there's a flyer outside on the table that gives the dates and locations for these workshops. So we have 3 workshops currently scheduled, one in Sacramento, one in Central and Tracy, and one in Southern California. And we want to hear from the public and get feedback on the amendment. And then we will take all the feedback that we get and develop a second draft that we'll bring to the council in March for any further comment or review. And we will also follow that up with a CEQA scoping meeting. We anticipate that'll be March 24th at this time, but that date's not firm, so tune back in shortly, and we will definitely announce that at our workshops and on our website, and we'll be sending out notices as well. And then the intent is to come back in April with a third draft, request the council to approve that to begin the CEQA process. And that's all I have. Any questions?
Questions of staff? I'll kick it off. Can you describe how you've coordinated with the Water Commission related to their Prop 1 storage funding, their guidelines, and their ecosystem requirements as per the Prop 1 storage
Sure, I
funds?
could chime in for that. As council staff, we've been encouraged in coordinating with the staff of the Water Commission and development of their regulations from, I guess, the late 2015, I think it was, when they started, all the way to their adoption end of last year. So we've been on several coordination meetings with state agency stakeholders, as well as providing input and recommendations on their draft regulations as they've been moving forward. So we've also taken some of their information that they've received. There's been some priorities laid out by statute in the Prop 1 regulations that require priorities from Fish and Wildlife and the State Water Board as far as different items such as water quality issues or Endangered Species Act preservation. And we've kind of included those as items that should reflect in our recommendations here.
Okay, good. Ken?
Yeah, I have a few comments and questions, and I'll try and make it more coherent than what I asked Dan on the previous item. It actually relates back to that. One of the things to maybe consider in the next draft, and Mr. Chair, is staff looking for specific comments from council members?
Yeah, I would say.
Absolutely. That's
Okay.
the purpose of this agenda
I have my
item
notebook
is to,
out, so.
this is a staff draft. This is the first one. They want our input.
That said, there's a lot there, and so to the extent, we have a workshop scheduled in Sacramento on March 9th that the council members would attend, and that would also be an opportunity not only to hear from the public, but to have these discussions in advance of the preparation of a March draft. So this isn't your only opportunity, but by all means.
So you're looking at this as an iterative process where we're going to continue to provide input. Good. One of the things, as I said, it kind of relates back to, some of the questions I had on the previous item is, maybe more discussion in the problem statement about the status quo and really, the sense that we're talking about conveyance, storage, and operations, because if we don't do something to enhance those three things, conditions are going to deteriorate, and they're going to deteriorate for both of the co-equal goals. So I think, even though this is part of the Delta Plan as a whole, people are going to be reviewing this kind of on its own, almost like a standalone document. So I think, it's better for the public to understand why we have to take some action. And along with that, as you get into the recommendations, maybe some more detail about, I'll give you an example that I saw. It's sort of the recommendation to do a below ground conveyance facility. But I was thinking, okay, well, what are the reasons that we wind up there as a recommendation? So thinking about some of your recommendations, tying it into the problem statement or in justifications, because immediately I said, well, my experience in construction is you go underground because you don't want to disrupt the community. That's one reason. I'm sure there's other reasons, seismic reasons or whatever, but I think recognizing that and maybe tying it back to other parts of the plan would help. So that's kind of a general comment in kind of, trying to beef up that the introductory before the recommendations, and tying them to the recommendations and creating that reasoning. Another area, and I'm glad this is like one of multiple times we'll get to provide input, but another area that I know a lot of people talk about is the reduced reliance on the Delta. And it seems like there's definitional issues, and I think the performance measures you have are good, but there's some that may be conflicting with each other. And my real concern about making sure we're clear on this is because everywhere else in the amendment, we're promoting this facility approach, conveyance, operation, storage, optimizing the operations, and we're not necessarily talking about taking less water. We're just talking about taking it at different times. So, if we start comparing averages or years, we're gonna, I think we may be in contradiction with what we're trying to promote. So I think the first metric where you talked about water use on attachment A, the target decrease in volume of water use from the delta or percent of total water use, we may want to be real specific there. Because I think if you look at total water use and the reliance on the delta meeting less of your total water use, okay, that's an easy thing. That's something to measure, and that's in line with everything else we're doing in the Governor's Water Action Plan, the State Water Plan, all of that. So I think that's important. I'm going to go back to this issue of whenever we average and we don't look at specific water years, I think we kind of lose things, and then we go counter to what we're really advocating, which is optimizing all of these things and reducing the conflicts. And so, I think you're right on this, focusing on critically dry years. I don't know how that will work out because, the historic baseline may not be, the best measurement, but that's something to maybe think about. The other definitional issue, and this maybe goes back to, my former life, is that the legislation had reducing reliance in a region, or I can't remember the exact wording, except for the Department of Water Resources and the State Water Plan, no water manager or agency in the state plans or manages resources by a hydrologic region. They just only, in fact, the last updates of the State Water Plan, DWR was asking the regional and local agencies, hey, can you write what you're doing and how you're planning for water supply, and then we'll just throw it into your hydrologic region. So I think that's a problem, and I don't know how we would get hydrologic regions to prove this stuff up. So I don't know what the answer is here, but I think we need to kind of give people some amount of certainty on, what a region is and what we're looking for, how we're defining reduced reliance. And I think you can do that quantitatively, but I think we've really got to be clear and make sure that we're not providing a performance measure that's in conflict with what we're advocating on the whole to optimize the system and get as much as you can in those wet and normal years while you're still protecting the environment, which they're going to have to do to comply with whatever permit they have. So, I mean, these are sort of my first kind of bigger picture takes on this. But great job. I mean, I think you've really gotten this, really well. It just, a little more clarity and a little more foundational stuff to justify the recommendations.
Others? Susan?
I agree with Ken, great job. I think the problem statement is vastly improved from the initial problem statement, and I like the way that you've organized it. I have only a few questions. So on page 10, item F, contributing to more natural functional flows that support ecosystem health. Is that in addition to the previous page, item 2A at the bottom here, or is it just emphasizing 2A?
So you're asking, is it redundant, or is it designed to amplify one or the other?
Right.
My understanding in section B2, it's describing projects in the delta. So those benefits that for water storage that would provide more natural functional flows would be in that section, and then in item 3A, it's regarding projects outside the delta but within the delta water export area. So that's the difference between the two sections.
I think she was asking 2A versus 2F.
Oh, 2F, excuse me.
Yeah, I think the emphasis on 2A was more on timing and variability and how we can move water and more water at different times, but while still keeping in mind that we need to provide for more natural functional flows. Whereas item F was just another reference that, yes, for all projects, irrespective of timing, need to be paying attention to trying to achieve those more natural functional flows.
Okay.
But maybe an opportunity to clean it up.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then I was wondering, on page 12, items 3, A, B, and C talk about improving flexibility, new storage facilities, local agencies. And the way I read it, I am wondering if this section should be moved to section 1. Which is all the way on page, starts on page 5 for new conveyance, mostly because this seems to be talking more about conveyance.
Can you state again which sections you're focused on?
So on page 12, lines 16 through 30, I'm wondering, since it's a discussion of conveyance, should it be moved to the conveyance section?
Well, maybe Cassandra can expound on that, but I think that's where it gets tricky, where we're talking about the operations of conveyance.
Okay.
And that's why it's in the operations section, but there is quite a bit of overlap among all of these sections.
Should pursue the following new or improved conveyance. So it says pursue conveyance, but so the intent is that we're talking about the operation of this new conveyance.
And that's specifically referring to conveyance outside the delta, which would facilitate operational flexibility. So the first section is more conveyance within the delta, and then as far as conveyance outside the delta, it's related to improving operations of the entire system.
And there were several components that we kind of struggled to find the right place because operations, are so tied into the physical facilities themselves.
Right.
There's some where it could go in either section. And this is a case where we decided to group it with the operational discussion because in many ways, operation or facilities, for example, in Southern California, depending upon how you operate them, they can have effects on the delta and how the delta is operated, but those facilities aren't physically located within the delta. They have the same physical effects as others.
Yeah, I know this is really, you guys have done an amazing job. One thing that strikes me and that I really like about what you've done here is these readily turn into screening criteria for both conveyance and storage projects. So this excellent job. And my last point is I agree with Ken on the performance measures. I need to spend more time with the whole document to just in my own mind figure out how you would tie what look like screening criteria to performance measures and make the connections. It's quite the puzzle to figure out.
I should add that the performance measures that are cited in this document are just simply a very small summary of each one of those references, about 20 pages worth of data. Cliff?
I have a couple examples here, but they tend to be 10 to 15 pages length.
10 to 15 pages. So what you're getting is a couple of paragraphs. So there may be more detail in those 10 pages that gets at what you're concerned about. But I don't know that for sure. Yes.
One last question. On page 13, the item G at the bottom just kind of jumped right out at me in context of all the other items on that page. So a couple of things. On the other items, it doesn't really specify the who. Whereas the previous items, I make a kind of assumption about who, and then suddenly the core is singled out. And I agree with the statement, but I think I'd like to see encouragement of the core and its partners examining the possibility of revising the flood space reservation guidelines.
I chuckled because this was a discussion of topic when we were developing the principles. And at that time, in the midst of a drought, the encouragement was there's additional space that could be utilized that the Army Corps has reserved, and you need to have them take a look at it. Given the lens that we're looking through today, as I predicted then, you may think otherwise. So that's where this came from, was a specific recommendation from one of the experts that came before us as we were developing the principles. But I will say that there is one reservoir in the system, and that's Folsom. And with the upgrades that occurred a year ago, I don't think the flood curves have been adjusted in response to those changes. So that there is a specific need to at least update that one.
Thank you, Randy. Let me start with page 2, line 14.
Page 2, line 14.
Where, excuse me, maybe I need to get some water here, Randy.
I'll get it.
Starting with the conveyance improvements, you go on to say that allowing more water to be taken in wet periods and reducing exports in dry periods when conflicts with ecosystem needs exist. I think that's a good comment because it takes out years and includes periods. But when you go down to page 3, line 6, you get back to this, the sentence that starts with, this fundamental conflict magnified during dry water years when the system is needed at time, and you're back to using dry years. And so there may be situations where you have a year that's considered wet, but by the time fall comes around, there may not be enough water for fish and ecosystem. Page 2, line 18. Sentence starting with increased water storage capacity. At the end of that sentence, it talks about sustainably manage the state's aquifers. And this is getting back to what I was saying, is that we need to be able to somehow move the excess water to the area which will not just sustain but recharge groundwater. And I think that's key to this moving water around in the state during dry periods. Let's see, page 4, line 17. Toward the end of the paragraph where it says, more water storage above and below the delta. We also need to consider storage in the delta, maybe a larger Los Vaqueros storage. I mean, we need to think about the system, but we need to think about in-delta storage as well. Then page 5, line 4, conclusion. You have 2 bullets there. Design, implementation, and operation of new and improved water conveyance infrastructure that is consistent with the criteria in sections 1, 2, 3, and below. And should we not think in terms of one bullet, that being the last bullet? Why do we have and when it pretty much says the same thing? Or at least maybe I'm not reading it correctly.
I think we can clean the language up on that, but the first bullet refers to conveyance and the second bullet refers to storage.
Okay.
So that's why the first bullet says sections 1 and 3, which is conveyance options and operations, and the second refers to sections 2 and 3, which are storage and operations. But I think we could probably easily say that more simply.
Reason?
I think it was just to highlight that conveyance and storage are 2 different types of infrastructure solutions.
Okay. And then my last comment, page 17, line 14. Average reliance on Delta water supplies from 1998 to 2010. Then if you go down, same page, down to line 33, the years change from 98 to 2010 to 1975 through 2014. Why the 2 periods?
I think we're going to probably find that in terms of data availability for evaluating performance measures, we're going to end up, unfortunately, and sometimes appropriately, having different baselines for different measurements, but we can look further into that question.
Well, if that is in fact the case, then we should maybe make that more clear in the report. That's all I have, Randy. Thank you.
Patrick?
Yeah, this is hard, and you've given us a lot to work with. Continue. I think Ken's point that the document has to stand on its own as justification for the recommendations that are specific. In particular, the tone of the document emphasizes water reliability rather than ecosystem improvements.
So we have the co-equal goals, but this is mostly about one goal, not about the other. And the references to ecosystem, and there are some, recovering the delta ecosystem, restoring fisheries under a reasonable range of hydrologic conditions. It's in there, but you know what Skip drew our attention to in that page 3 sentence, beginning on line 6. Whereas the state and federal water systems once operated to export and move water through the delta when agricultural and municipal demands existed, these operations are now often in conflict with the regulatory requirements for the protection of endangered and threatened fish species. This is framed as a water exporter would frame it, which is, we need the water, we want the water, there's water there, but we're stuck because there's the Endangered Species Act. So we'll comply with it. What do we have to do to minimally comply with it? The law, the 2009 law, actually says that the state values water supply and the ecosystem. And I think the tone has to do that. In other words, if we're going to say in this that on the considerable analysis that's been done over the several years that we've been involved and lots of other agencies, point to an isolated facility below ground, and we recommend that, we should be prepared to write what the case is for an environmental improvement, not just a mitigation necessity. So I think you know, our other work and documents in the Delta Plan itself probably has some of that, and I know you were stuck with putting a lot into one document and how much more, but I'd like to see some balancing of those two values.
I would,
Judge?
let me just second what Pat said. I think if you take that, looking at that same paragraph on page 3, if you kind of reverse the order of those sentences, starting out with this fundamental conflict, what it is, describe that conflict, is magnified during the water years, and the system is needed at the same time that the delta ecosystem is vulnerable. I mean, that puts it much more in a better context, and I think Pat's right on in describing the tone, and I think the tone is not the right tone. And I think you get at that with the problem statement, and actually that paragraph would probably cover it.
Ken?
No, just to maybe follow up on a few comments you've heard. You know, on this issue, I was reading, and maybe my memory fails me, but in here, when we talk about the North Delta diversion, it's strictly for water quality. And somewhere back there, I thought that it improved protection for fish, and that, you know,
Smelt in particular.
yeah, and so, you know, that's a big issue. I mean, it gets back to sort of reinforcing why the status quo doesn't work, and that we're looking for, you know, conveyance that would actually take pressure off endangered and threatened fish, because that, you know, helps achieve the, like Patrick and Frank are saying, that helps achieve the other goal, the other co-equal goal. So, you know, I think this just gets back to restating, you know, what we're trying to solve. And, you know, maybe to follow up on one of the questions Susan had, this idea, the facilities, the operation of the facilities, you know, it sounded like, are we, these other facilities outside the Delta or moving from west to east in the San Joaquin Valley, are we advocating for new facilities? And I think this gets to Supervisor Thompson's comment earlier about, well, you got to have some place to put this excess water. You know, we're advocating whatever, 3 million acre feet of state water project storage is not a lot. I mean, you compare that to the Colorado River with 60 million acre feet. I think we heard that we're going to get to 50 in 2025, but are we advocating for more storage as part of this amendment that, the status quo on pumping and fish protection doesn't work, but also the status quo in storage? And one of my big questions through all this is, the role of groundwater storage and Sigma and, maybe, that taking a more prominent role in what we're trying to accomplish, which sounds like that's part of that 50 million acre feet. But it's not clear to me whether we're advocating for these things, that they need to be part of a solution, because that's the way we achieve the co-equal goals.
I mean, if you want to suggest language, that
Well,
would be
not right now,
appreciated.
but it's something to think about. But just it's kind of the justification, but also being clear. And maybe it's a different category. It's like, hey, we need, there's new facilities that we need that, meet these operational goals. But if we don't get those new facilities, we can't do it. If we don't have conveyance, we can't get more water out of the system. If we don't have some place to put it or a way to put it in there, we can't achieve it. So it's a more comprehensive approach.
And I think that's one of the reasons why we tried to articulate, particularly in the storage section, that storage is needed not just within the Delta watershed, but within the export area. And we called that out as a separate area because it has a very different type of role and can provide a very different type of benefit than storage in the watershed can.
One last question. Page 5, line 15. Why are we making recommendations on specific projects?
Can you repeat that question one more time?
Why are we making recommendations on specific projects?
I guess
think-
that's the way
Yeah.
we're interpreting the promoting options, as we tried to be specific with the guidance from the principals. but-
Shouldn't we want to know what the projects look like once they're more formed, if you will, or rolled out?
Well, I think according to Water Code 85304, we're to promote options for storage, conveyance, storage, and the operations of both. I think we've taken an outcome-oriented approach to this. So we're describing how to achieve the outcomes that we established in our principles a year or more ago. So there seems to be a lack of describing how the conclusions were drawn to these particular options. Because in any situation, there's myriad options, but you sort through those and you come up with what you think are the best options to promote. So what I'm hearing from you is, how did you get to this point?
Well, and Randy, I think I mentioned this earlier to you, is that, the perception is that we're trying to force this project, this conveyance project, until we really looked at all the alternatives. And so when we start supporting a project or projects early on before any of the environmental, do these projects meet the co-equal goals, I guess, is the obvious question. And I'm struggling to figure out how they meet them and how we can support them until we've done our research. So, basic question, but one that I think I'm not comfortable with, and I don't know that we have been given an answer yet. So, we'll have a few more opportunities, I'm sure. Thank you.
So Skip's question reminds me that a few of us have swirled around these issues for quite a while, and I'm vaguely recalling in Delta Vision, I can't remember who said it, but someone said, you know, we've been over and over and over this since 1982, and I really don't understand why we're mapping all these all over again, because it boils down to you can either go through, around, or under. And that really struck me. And so perhaps somewhere, maybe in the introduction, we give the readers a sense of the history of how long this problem has been examined and the various offerings of options, not specifics, but types, categories of options, and I think that might be helpful. And then I have only one other comment on page 3, speaking of tone, on line 18. I would encourage that we stay away from wording like the word valid, and refer more to place it in the context of state mandates, such as the Water Board's authority to balance beneficial uses. And that way we don't get into arguments about what's valid or invalid, etc.
Judge?
Yeah, I want to second the comment that was just made by Susan. I think you need historical perspective here. That's missing. And we're working under a legislative mandate, okay? But that presupposes things that have happened long before there was a legislative mandate, and there's been a history to this, and I think that that is critical for a person reading this, particularly whether it's an introduction. I think that would be the best place, but maybe call it a historical perspective. Just lay it out. This is not the first time this subject has come up by a long shot. We've discussed this, since I've been on, but long before I ever made this position, it's been discussed and engineered and rethought and abandoned and rethought. And I mean, I think that sense is very important as a preamble to the document.
You're getting input.
Yes, this is great. Thank you. I wanted to thank the council for all the excellent comments, and I'm definitely looking forward to continuing to revise this, and through an iterative process is really helpful.
Anything else? Probably plenty for now. Do you have any questions of us? Any clarification on anything that you've heard? Probably not. Okay.
No, our work's cut out for us, so we're good.
Yeah. Any requests for public comment? All right. If you would like to make a comment, there's a blue card. We'd ask you to fill that out. You can fill that out after you're finished. It's fine. Identify yourself and...
Am I on already? Oh. Thomas Pate, Salmon County Water Utility District Engineer. One thing that always struck me when I read the Delta Plan is when you talk about water supply reliability, it's a very broad term. When you look at the Delta and the surrounding regional area, there's the export Delta water supply, but then there's also a local water supply component that really never gets brought out and highlighted like it probably should. Because we always talk about how the co-equal goals need to provide like water, protect water quality for in-delta use, but what about the water supply side of in-delta use should also be protected as well. So I just wanted to kind of raise that point that, it'd be nice to see just a little bit more of a finer point on what water supply reliability is, and that there are two components of it. There's the statewide grander scheme, but there's also some water supply issues in the local region that need to be addressed as well.
And going to Jessica's earlier comments, this is a part of, it's being considered as an amendment to the Delta Plan, which includes one chapter devoted to water quality. So we need to and water supply. So we need to, again, view this through the lens of the entire Delta plan, but comment is well taken. Any other requests for public comment? Well, I think that concludes file item 12. Staff, thank you very much.
We'll
Jessica,
see
any-
you on March 9th at 8:30 at the Sheraton.
That'll be the public meeting here in Sacramento on this matter. So that concludes file item 12. File item 13, public comment on any matter. There is none. We are now adjourned for the day. See you here at 9 o'clock tomorrow. Thank you.